Hello everybody. YouTube with live streaming informs me that I am alive, which is something that parts of me want to dispute, but apparently, since I am still amongst the realms of the living and do not require the services of a necromancer, we are here with the 25-hour delayed live stream portion of the Patreon Drydock. So, as per usual, we will be starting off with the Patreon history, etc. questions first, and then moving off into the stuff that the chat has asked. So if you have some questions and you'd like to ask them in the chat, probably best to hold off, because I can guarantee you by the time I reach the end of the Patreon questions, your question is going to be way too high. So, but then obviously when I get to the end, ask away. Yeah, I did get a bit of sleep. So there's that. Colin Williams is the first one leading in with our Patreon questions. He asks, ignoring the necessary tooling and build time, if it's 1935 and the US Navy has accidentally ordered a few thousand extra 5-inch 38 caliber guns with dual purpose mounts in both singles and pairs, and in an attempt to move them all before Admiral King finds out, the Royal Navy has been offered them with a good initial supply of shells at or below cost, as well as licensing to build the shells. So effectively, you're being offered a couple of thousand free 5-inch 38s or near enough. Now, what ships do you put them on? And what guns do you entirely phase out? And how giddy are you? Okay, so if we're talking about several thousand, I mean, even on full-on capital ships that you need to use 20, that's 5 capital ships for 100. We've only got 15, although there's more buildings, so you could re-gun the entire Royal Navy's capital ship fleet with less than a third of that bounty. But in terms of priority builds, what would I do? So it's 1935. And it's possible. I mean, I can't regun everything that uses a something between 4 and 5.5 inch gun in the Royal Navy, because even with 1,000 5-inch 38s, I am going to run out at some point. So my priorities then. First thing would be rearming cruisers. So there was a program in place to convert the old C-class cruisers into anti-aircraft ships. And actually HMS Delhi, for example, would get a fit-out of 5-inch 38s due to wartime issues, but a lot of them were being refitted with 4 or 4-point-something inch weapons in place of their old 6-inch guns. Now, they would be first on the list. So now I've got all the guns, so as many C-class as I can justify are going to get stripped down and have 5-inch 38s installed. Probably that's going to consist of maybe a twin mount forward, a twin mount aft, and a bunch of singles down the sides, because they are old World War I style ships, so they're designed for wing mounted guns. So single unshielded guns down the side to optimise on weight, and twin mounts fore and aft. So that'll give you a nice suite of anti-aircraft cruisers. My newer cruisers that are being manufactured, so at that point you're talking about basically towns and the Crown colonies, just use the 5-inch 38s as their secondaries. So you're going to have 4 twins on the regular towns. Edinburgh and Belfast are going to carry 6, and so on and so forth. So basically my cruiser anti-aircraft firepower is going to be significantly increased. I personally don't think, I mean, it might be a bit too late for some of the Didos anyway, but I'm not going to rearm the Didos entirely with 5-inch 38s. The 5.25 does have its merits when it comes to long-range surface action, and that, well, considering this is a retrospective, I know that's going to be an issue for them in the Mediterranean. But the one where you have Didos that were only completed with 4 twins, or Didos that were completed with lighter guns than 5.25s because of the supply shortages, all of those would receive a full fit out of 10 guns using twin 5.25s. So my heavy emphasis is going to be on cruisers. Then I'm going to move on, I think, to the older capital ships, the ones that don't get refits, because, you know, Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, Renown being refitted with 4.5-inch guns, they're pretty much good enough. There's not a huge amount to be gained by swapping them out for 5-inch 38s. Obviously, by the rating system I did in the AA gun video, the 5-inch 38 is slightly better, but I do have a limited number of them, and the 4.5 is still pretty good. Same with the carriers. So they've got the 4.5s, they're pretty good. So what I would do instead is ships like Hood, Repulse, Warspite as well, all would have their AA guns replaced with 5-inch 38s in varying types. So the R-class, the Malaya and Barham. So anything that's not a new refit would get 5-inch 38s. Now, that covers my older capital ships. It covers my cruisers. I might then start... Oh, yes, the other thing, the older cruisers. So the counties, as they get pulled in for their mid to late 1930s refits, they're going to have their 4.7s replaced by, and 4-inch replaced by 5-inch 38s. The King George V's with their 5.25s, I would be highly tempted to supplant them with the twin 5-inch 38s, but again, given that I'm basically rearming my entire cruiser fleet and my older capital ships, I might be starting to run a little bit low on the guns. So whilst redoing the King George V with 5-inch 38s might be on the cards, it would be on a priority list below rearming some of the destroyers. So, I mean, some destroyers, older destroyers, 4-inch guns, etc., but some destroyers are armed, more recent ones, and in 1935 upcoming destroyer designs, are being armed with a 4.7, which is great for anti-surface work, but not so great for anti-aircraft work. So I think it makes sense at that point to rearm or arm my latest destroyers with twin 5-inch 38s. So you're talking sort of the JKL, M and N's. Whether the tribals are an interesting one, because the 8 4.7s do give them a hilarious amount of anti-surface firepower. But I mean, while you're at it, you might as well. I mean, watching a tribal go to town if it has 4 twin 5-inch 38s would be quite funny, especially given the number of them that fell victim to air attack, and they're now able to put up a fairly decent defence. So I think the destroyers would be the second priority after the third priority after the cruisers. So cruisers first, old capital ship second, destroyers third, the newer build ones especially, and then if I've somehow got some 5-inch guns left over after that, then maybe I'll look at substituting in the 5.25s on the KGVs, but I don't think I'm going to get that far. SMS Schleswig-Holstein says, what are some good books on the development of Union monitors during the American Civil War? That is a good question. Let me check my book list. Where is it? There it is. No, that's just general US Civil War. Where are we? That's blockade runners. That doesn't help. Okay, so probably a good start would be William H. Roberts' Civil War Ironclads, the US Navy and Industrial Mobilization. I mean, clues in the title, really. But that looks at not just, obviously, the monitors themselves, but also how the Union mobilized and in some cases modernized its industry to be able to produce them. So if you want to look at the development of the monitors during the Civil War, that's definitely, I would say, your first port of call, and then expand out from there. I mean, the Osprey books are probably decent as well in general, but obviously they do have limitations from the fact they're relatively thin publications. But that would be my recommendation. Start with that book, then, as always, look in the bibliography and expand out from there. People saying hello. Hello, Cara. Corvus asking, watch glass timing. In Master and Commander, one of the little vignettes showing shipboard life had sand running out in a watch glass, the marine on watch inverting it, then striking the bell the proper number of strokes. And this got me wondering on how the time differential is handled when travelling eastbound. Assuming everything is reset at the noon sighting, even at the leisurely pace of a tall ship, local noon might arrive before the sand in the glass for the forenoon watch has run out. Was the glass a little short of a half hour? Was the glass a little short of a half hour and restarted at noon? Was there a second glass kept handy to start while yesterday's glass ran its final minutes out, or was the discrepancy simply ignored? You'd be surprised, because you think about, roughly speaking, your time zones as we understand them today with an hour's time difference, and how far you need to go. Now, bear in mind that in the vast majority of cases, an Age of Sail ship is not going to be running full pelt, so it's not going to be running 10 plus knots. It's going to be running probably 6 to 8 knots, maybe not even that if the weather's hasn't got particularly strong winds, and they're very often not running directly east or west. So they may be running, southwest, southeast, northwest, or whatever, and also may not be going on in a straight course anyway. So, in the vast majority of cases, you're not going to be too far off. Basically, they're gonna take a fair amount of time to get from what we might call one time zone to the next. And the other thing is, of course, that we're thinking in terms of hours. Their local noon sighting obviously is going to be in increments, so a few minutes, maybe 10-15 minutes at most if they've run with the wind quite heavily, at which point it's more about just keeping the ship on a schedule where everyone gets to sleep approximately a reasonable amount of time and everyone stands approximately the same watch. So at that point, exactly how long each day is less important for the day-to-day running of the ship. It is obviously much more important for determining where the ship is, which is a completely separate matter, which is why they have issues with clocks and everything. But by the time that Master and Commander is set, the issue of clocks at sea has already been sorted for working out where you are in terms of latitude and longitude, obviously using the clock for one and using sun or star sightings for the other. So at that point, the hourglass position just for watches doesn't really matter all that much. Lydia, sorry, hang on. Pendon Harley asks, in early 1914, SMS Von der Tann and SMS Blücher and a couple more protected cruisers are sent to Tsingtao to reinforce Von Spee's East Asia squadron. In August, what does Von Spee do with this larger force and how does the Admiralty react? Okay, so if Blücher and Von der Tann are sent out to Von Spee in early 1914, the Admiralty would have reacted around about that time. They would have dispatched additional battle cruisers. Or perhaps, obviously you've got Australia's already out there. You've got the early Congos coming online for Japan. but those are two separate navies, only one of which is nominally under British control. So I suspect the Admiralty would have... I mean, Von der Tann and Blücher... I suspect you probably would have seen HMS New Zealand sent back out to the Australasian waters. Obviously, she went and said hi to New Zealand, the country, earlier. So I think you probably see New Zealand and Australia stationed out there, and they probably would have dispatched a squadron of armoured cruisers, one of the 3 or 4 latest classes, to back it up, as well as obviously the Royal Australian Navy and whatever else the Admiralty had out there in terms of day-to-day shipping, and of course the French and the Russians, and obviously the Japanese have their own ships there as well. Because, you know, the Admiralty knows exactly what battle cruisers are designed for, and if the Germans are sending a battle cruiser and a big armoured cruiser out there, that's a very big obvious threat. They're not going to let that stand. At which point, von Spee is probably going to do the same thing that he did historically, which is sail to somewhere where he thinks he's not going to be horribly and horrifically outgunned, i.e. he's going to sail east. The other thing is, if he's got as important capital assets to the High Seas Fleet in 1914 as Von der Tann and Blücher, he's going to be especially motivated to get those home. So he's definitely going to end up trying to head for home in some way, shape or form. Now, if for whatever reason the Admiralty really drops the ball and does nothing in reaction to it, and you get to September, October, and you know, von Spee therefore commands the most powerful squadron unless the Japanese show up in the area, he might try and move to engage the Royal Australian Navy. But again, whilst he does have a lot of power, you're still going to have this issue of von Spee is going to want to get those ships back into the control of the High Seas Fleet. So I think he'd still head for home, but he might head for home trying to go maybe via the Indian Ocean instead of via the Pacific, because he'll be a little bit more willing to accept a fight if it comes to it, and therefore he might be happy to risk interception by the Australia. Shazix, how would the Martian war in War of the Worlds impact naval development, assuming minimal damage to infrastructure in the UK? And your Thunderchild video history change is the only naval development change. Well, if you if you stick by the strict canon of the War of the Worlds book alone, because there have been various attempts at canon expansion to that universe, but if you stick to the H.G. Wells book, then it seems that the cylinders only land in Britain, which means that the flying machine, whatever that is down somewhere in the UK, and the vast majority of Martian tripods are also down in the UK, as are the cylinders and whatever technology they've got in there as well. Obviously, a few of them might be out to sea, like the ones that Thunderchild took on were, but they won't have got very far. One of the slightly less appreciated parts of War of the Worlds is that in the closing stage of the Thunderchild chapter, it seems like probably what's the Channel Fleet moves in to engage the Martians, but we don't see what happens, and the book doesn't actually comment on it later on, so we don't know how much of the Channel Fleet is left by the end of the book. But assuming that the infrastructure damage to the UK is relatively minimal, they're the ones who've got all the Martian technology. So at that point, I suspect it's probably going to come down to how much of the Royal Navy has gone down fighting the Martians, because word is going to get out of what the Martian technology can do. If the Royal Navy looks to be critically weakened, then a lot of the other powers, especially the French just across the channel, are going to turn around and go, there is no way on earth we want the UK to be the sole owners of this brand new, very, very capable technology, and they might well try and threaten Britain to get access to it. if the Royal Navy still has a decent chunk of the Royal Navy intact and can defend its shores, then whilst they might have some very aggressive overtures from other countries, they're probably going to stand their ground on the basis of they only need enough time to either retro-engineer or just figure out how to operate and mount the Martian technology on their ships, and then they're golden. So, given that it's at the turn of the 20th century, 1900, you probably don't get the Dreadnought Revolution, because you don't need a Dreadnought Revolution when your pre-Dreadnoughts are packing heat rays. Avoid Shisnos asks, I have seen it said that in the lead up to World War One, the Germans tried to buy ships out of US yards, and in the lead up to World War II, the British considered the same, with the exception of the Destroyers for Bases deal. I can find no proof of these claims and was wondering if there's any truth for them. For example, did the British try and get new built ships and were rebuffed and thus settled for mothball ships? And would it have made any difference? I have not heard of anything where the British in the immediate run up to World War II tried to order brand new warships from the US, because one, they didn't think that war was coming in 1939. They thought it was coming in 42, 43-ish. And the Royal Navy has, for a very long time, had a policy, and Britain's had a policy, of British warships must be built by British companies in Britain, or in the case of that period, in the Empire. With, of course, the exception of those that are generously donated by foreign navies in battle. So, there, in 37, 38, which would be the run-up to World War II, I can't see any reason, and I can't recall any records that show the British trying to buy new-build warships from the States. Obviously, in World War II, when things are desperate, that changes, but even then, the vast majority of US-built ships and aircraft that come over to the UK are done under Lend-Lease, so they're not technically entirely British anyway, which is why a bunch of those aircraft get chucked over the side at the end of the wars to avoid having to pay for them. As far as the Germans trying to buy ships out of American yards in the lead up to World War I, again, no, I don't think that's a thing, because as I covered in the Dreadnought Arms Race video, in 1912 and thereafter, the German Navy had its funding cut quite massively in favour of the army, which kind of was the end of the Dreadnought race. The 1913 and 14 build programs were basically the British just establishing further dominance in terms of battleships. So the German naval budget wasn't going to stretch to that, to buying ships from the US in addition to building ships in their own dockyards, and because of that cut, their own dockyards had spare capacity. This is the thing, you would only, as Germany in pre-World War I or Britain in pre-World War II, you would only look to buy ships from a foreign yard if A, you were desperate, which, okay, you could make an argument that both of them might have been in certain circumstances, but also B, you have to have the money for it, and you have to lack the dockyard space in your own country. In World War I, the Germans have the dockyard space in 1912, 1913, 1914. So why would they spend their money overseas when they can just build more at home if they've got that resource? And maybe not so much for the British. They are running much closer to capacity in the lead up to World War II. But as I said, they don't think they're going to be fighting World War II in 1939. So they're not going to be in the position of desperation that they would be later on, actually during the war, when they're accepting deliveries of things like escort carriers. Walter Broad, US, we're talking old H.G. Wells school War of the Worlds. Burnt potato. A mad Frenchman is marauding around the world attempting to steal the world's supply of potatoes. He has a fleet consisting of a Richelieu, 2 Dunkirks, 3 La Galissonière, and 3 Le Fantasque. The King and Parliament are missing their chips for the fish and chips and have tasked you to hunt down the would-be potato thief and given you access to an equal number of British battleships or battle cruisers, and destroyers. All ships are in 1940 configuration, in good repair, and the French have reported to favour aggressive charges. Okay, well, for one thing, this French task force is fast. All of those ships are fast vessels. Some of them are very, very fast vessels, which means that if I've got any chance of catching them or boxing them into a corner, unfortunately, that means I can't take something like the Nelsons, even as I might want to, because having Richelieu versus Nelson, a head-on fight of all forward gun ships, would be quite amusing. But Rodney and Nelson aren't going to be able to keep it anywhere close. So, I mean, in 1940. So I can get King George V. I can't really take Prince of Wales. She was only just about getting it into service in 41. So King George V, Renown, definitely. And then, see, the thing is, at that point, I have a choice between Hood and Repulse for taking on the other Dunkirk. Repulse is actually in better material condition, but Hood obviously has an extra pair of guns and better armour. And obviously Mersel Kabir 1940 config, Hood did strip a turbine trying to actually catch Strasbourg. So, based purely on material condition, I'd take Renown, Repulse, and King George V. If Hood was up and running, I'd take Renown, Hood, and King George V. But Hood's quite likely to break down in that particular chase. As for cruisers, if I'm mirror matching, then I'd be probably going for 3 counties, and the destroyers I take 6 tribals. So that would be my mirror match for that kind of fleet. Classe Cornet, which ship would win, an L20e Alpha or a G3? And could the G3 still win if they were outnumbered 7 to 10? L20e Alpha or G3 matchup is going to be a G3, because the L20e Alpha is a late 1917, early 1918 design process vessel. The G3 is a 1920 design process vessel, and yes, that's only 2 or 3 years difference, but 3 years design differences gives you the difference between a 12-inch gunner like Colossus or an early 13.5 like Orion and the Queen Elizabeths at the other end of the 1910s. So, I mean, or to give it an American example, the design era difference between when L20e Alpha is designed and when the G3s are designed is the difference between a Tennessee and the 1920 South Dakota. There's quite the design and development leap going on there. If it's 7 G3s versus 10 L20e Alphas in a stand-up gunfight, they're probably not going to win if they just form battle lines and shoot at each other, because 3 of the L20e Alphas have free shooting practice against 3 of the G3s. Der Flinger showed exactly what you can do with that in the run to the south. But on the other hand, the G3s have a speed advantage, so if it was a choose your time and place a fight in an open ocean, the G3s might be able to pull off simply by isolating the head portion of the L20e Alpha line and picking them off first before the others can come in to engage. So, Kaz Talon, if Warspite takes the place of Hood at the Battle of the Denmark Strait, would she have a similar fate or survive? Assuming that Warspite is blown up by Bismarck and Hood steps in to fill Warspite's wartime career role with no major refit or construction apart from an engine overhaul, would she have been as successful as Warspite or struggled more? Okay, so that's 2 parts. If Warspite takes place of Hood at the Battle of Denmark Strait, the battle doesn't happen, because Warspite is much slower. So, even if she's really pushing at 25 knots, they're never going to make the interception. So Bismarck and Prince Eugen will sail off happily into the sunset, and something else will happen. If Warspite is magically substituted in place of Hood at the point that everybody's opening fire at each other, to be honest, even then the Germans can break off the action because of the sudden drop in speed of the British formation. Plus, Prince of Wales is going to have to pull some rather interesting manoeuvres to not run into Warspite. But assuming that for whatever reason the gunfight actually takes place, the precise circumstances of Hood being destroyed are so 1 in a million that you put in a slower, different dimension ship like Warspite, then no, it's not going to have a similar fate. Also, Warspite and Hood, at least on their main belt, have a broadly similar level of protection, because the whole spec of Hood was Queen Elizabeth protection on 30 knots. The thickness and angling of the armour is different, but the overall protective quality is broadly the same. The other thing, of course, is that Warspite, being a refit ship and also seemingly a plot armoured ship, has much better shooting. So whilst Hood got a bunch of salvos at Bismarck and at Prince Eugen and didn't hit anything, it's relatively likely that given the same number of salvos, Warspite's more likely to have identified correctly who it should be shooting at in the first place, and B is more likely to have started scoring hits, which then puts butterflies as to, who wins what. Not necessarily saying that Warspite would win a gunfight with Bismarck in terms of sinking Bismarck, because if Bismarck starts taking hits from both Warspite and Prince of Wales, then again it has the speed to just go, I'm leaving this party. And obviously Warspite is vulnerable to Bismarck's 15-inch shells at certain places, depending on the range and the angle, etc. But it's not going to. It's very unlikely to detonate the way that Hood does. Second part is if Warspite's blown up and Hood gets slotted into what Warspite did, mostly Mediterranean work, obviously, and she only has an engine overhaul, she is going to struggle compared to Warspite. She's not going to be as successful, because while she can get places, like going to fight the Italians, faster, the problem is, one, she's still only a single vessel. Warspite, when she hit Giulio Cesare, she got there, she got to the fight, and then had to do circles waiting for Malaya and one of the R-class to catch up. Hood would be in the same situation. She can't afford to run ahead of everybody else because she still is only one ship, which means her speed, except in very specific circumstances, is going to be hobbled by everybody else being so much slower than she is. And also, again, because Hood hasn't been modernised and Warspite had been, Hood still has her early 1920s vintage fire control system. Warspite had obviously been updated with much newer fire control tables. So a lot of the stuff that Warspite does with her gunnery and obviously with her radar control, have her ability to use radar as well, a lot of that isn't going to be in play. So she's going to be less accurate, less able to see the enemy, so overall less successful than Warspite. About the only area where she might shine a little bit better might be in Operation C, because if Hood is there instead of Warspite with Somerville and 2 armoured carriers, then the cruising speed and the attack speed of the British formation is much higher, so they might get into contact with Nagumo, maybe, but then Hood isn't going to have the same kind of night fighting capability that Warspite would have had if she's only had an engine overhaul. If Hood had had a full overhaul, so she had the latest and greatest radar and the latest and greatest fire control stuck on her in addition to an engine overhaul, then that would all change, but that's what the word of the question says. Lord of Epic Randomness asks, I don't know if you've ever heard of, let alone played, Enigma Rising Tide. No. I haven't. Anyway, it presents an alternate history and a tedious exercise in chaos theory to the point that Germany somehow wins World War One and Scapa Flow is now a German base. Okay. The Americans pull a Pearl Harbor-style attack on the Germans there, and the leader of Germany, Manfred von Richthofen, who apparently has become bulletproof, reads the writing on the wall about the end of the big gun battleship era and orders Bismarck and Tirpitz completed as battle carriers. Oh, no. Okay, well, he's obviously been eating Panzerschokolade when he was reading the writing on that particular wall. So they have an Issei-style set of twin turrets front and a flight deck aft. Would it have been a better option for Germany to have built Bismarck and Tirpitz as carriers, or at the least battle carriers from the very beginning? No, not battle carriers. You build Bismarck and Tirpitz as battle carriers, they're basically even more useless than they historically were, because no one's going to take them seriously, and you're not going to have a decent air group either. As I've said before, with the Issei conversions, the only legitimate, and that's very marginal, use of a battle carrier is to act as a fighter cap launching and recovery vessel to support a larger carrier fleet, which Germany does not have. And even then, that's really, really pushing it. If Bismarck and Tirpitz, on the other hand, had been ordered as carriers from the very beginning, i.e. the Germans just decided to build 3 Graf Zeppelins in their build program instead of 2 Bismarcks and a Graf Zeppelin, and then obviously the successor stuff they tried to build thereafter, that might have worked out as a better option for the Germans. I mean, it's not going to win them the war, obviously, but it might, in terms of raiding effectiveness, that might have worked out at least better for them in the first half of the war, I'd say, because I've gone over in the past with how effective could a Graf Zeppelin style carrier have been as a surface raider, and actually the answer is surprisingly effective, at least in 1940 and 1941, maybe into 1942. So alternate carrier Bismarck, probably a half decent idea, I would say. Certainly would have probably been a fairly successful raider for as long as it lasted, albeit that's a heck of a use for a fleet carrier. But second half of the war, alternate version of Tirpitz, probably much less successful, because the various schemes that the Royal Navy and the RAF put in place to try and deal with Tirpitz, that eventually ended up with Tirpitz being tall-buoyed, a lot of those earlier ones, where if you did that to a Graf Zeppelin hull, would have totaled the Graf Zeppelin hull. The X-craft assault probably would have paid to the ship. The mass strikes by the Fleet Air Arm with Barracudas and bombs from the air also probably would have totaled a Graf Zeppelin, when they didn't quite total Tirpitz, although she was being nibbled to death. So yeah, carrier versions of the Bismarck class probably would have overall therefore evened out. They would have been more successful in the first part of the war, but both of the ships probably would have been gone a lot sooner in the second part. Salty Viking asks, if you designed your perfect destroyer with tech that was actually created, what would you build it with? Hull, superstructure, torpedo mounts, anti-aircraft, ASW, etc. I'm going to assume you mean World War II tech. So if you're going to go with, a complete Frankenstein ship that somehow is magically going to work, World War II tech destroyers. I mean, the thing is, if you go into too far into World War II, then you start to get obviously the later models of destroyer, which start to push things a little bit. So if we go with, let's say, a theoretical 1939-1940 quote-unquote perfect destroyer, I'd take ASDIC, the British sonar. I'd take something like a tribal class hull, but with 3 twin 5-inch 38 mounts, 2 quintuple or sextuple if I can fit them, long lance torpedo launchers. Might as well keep the Tribal's superstructure profile. There's not much in that compared to everybody else's, apart from obviously the Germans that keep trying to flip themselves upside down, so don't do that. And the lighter anti-aircraft guns, 20mm Oerlikons, maybe a 40mm Bofors or two if I can find the space, and then obviously all the standard radar fits. So yeah, it's effectively a British hull, American guns, and Japanese torpedoes would be my combination for 1939-1940. Seawolf. Let's say the Spanish Navy survives the 36-39 Civil War more or less intact, and the subsequent Spanish government maintains some interest in having a worthwhile fleet, possibly with financial backing from Germany or Italy. If the Germans then manage to secure a significant portion of the French Navy in an operable condition, and by some witchcraft have the ability to crew and fuel it, when Hitler, guided by his dartboard of terrible ideas from the Napoleonic era, inevitably decides to launch a second Franco-Spanish invasion attempt on Britain, is there any remotely plausible scenario where a combination of French, Spanish and German fleets can threaten to actually pull this off? No. Basically. Because you're talking about, again, late 1940. Richelieu is probably the least likely of all the French ships for the Germans to get their hands on, because it's very far away. The bulk of the French fleet, what do you get if you get the bulk of the French fleet? Probably Dunkirk and Strasbourg. Okay, they're threats, and the French cruisers and destroyers are threats as well. The Britannias and the Corbeys are not particularly threats, except that they have some big guns. But in a straight up fight with any battleship, or to be honest, in a straight up fight with anything, they're not a particularly great threat. They're not really been upgraded all that much, and they weren't particularly brilliant to begin with anyway. The Spanish have the marginal sort of the marginal competence of having the three smallest dreadnoughts ever built at that point, assuming they've not managed to run any of them onto rocks. They've got a couple of interesting cruisers, but even if you add the Kriegsmarine, or what's left of the Kriegsmarine in 1940, plus, let's say, 80% of the French fleet, plus the Spanish fleet, such as it is, because they're not going to get all that much other than maybe destroyers and a cruiser or two completed between maybe a shorter civil war in 1940. On paper, numerically, it's obviously a lot more impressive, but you still have the problem of, one, coordinating all of that, getting it somehow all into the channel, and the British are going to have destroyers, submarines, aircraft, etc., waiting for the French and Spanish elements to try and get in the western end of the channel, while the Kriegsmarine tries to come in through the Dover Straits. And there's so many other issues. I mean, yes, they can threaten Sea Lion a bit more plausibly in that case, but given what the Royal Navy was prepared to throw in to defend against it, and given what the shore defences were going to do to anything that landed, the only thing I'd say is it might give the Germans the confidence to try. It's not going to give them the ability to succeed, outside of some very, very weird circumstances. Ferocious asks, according to your expertise, how would space warfare tactics work with the technology and material now available to us? Single battles between capital ships comparable to Star Trek, brutal line battles like Warhammer 40,000, or long-range fights with small ships, fighters, drones and rockets comparable to Battlestar Galactica. With the technology and material now available to us, space warfare would be very boring, if incredibly high tension, because at the moment, outside of some somewhat interesting ideas, you can put a shuttle equivalent into low orbit if we actually had a working shuttle equivalent. Other than that, everything else is small, effectively capsule crewed ships and stuff like Soyuz modules. So we don't have, with current technology and materials, we don't have capital ships. We don't even have anything that really legitimately could be called a ship. We have spacecraft that kind of the size of medium to large aircraft. And I mean, space warfare tactics, therefore you're probably going to see missiles. Basically, it'd be like modern air-to-air combat to a degree. It'd be missiles, but with less ability to dodge, but perhaps a little bit more ability to counter. Because if you were able to get a multi-man spacecraft into space, whether that be a Soyuz capsule, a Dragon capsule, or someone hauls a space shuttle out of retirement, they would be carrying somewhat greater payloads than your average one-man fighter. So, given the ranges that you could achieve in space, where obviously drag is not so much of an issue, I suspect people would just be volleying missiles at each other and then volleying counter missiles at the missiles, and then hoping that the destruction of the missiles in between doesn't result in just a spray of debris that peppers you and knocks you out anyway. So it will be exciting, brutal, and short, and probably almost entirely fought by computers. Trevor Polasek. The day before Jutland, BT spontaneously combusts and is replaced by a bemused Lord Nelson from right before Trafalgar. Knowing the status of the legendary Admiral, Jellicoe keeps him in charge of the battle cruisers and gives him a crash course on the capability of modern ships. How does Nelson perform at Jutland? If he's got 24 hours to learn, it's not going to be particularly brilliant, because obviously, well, Nelson wants a pell-mell... Nelson's whole thing at the time is pell-mell melee battle at close range, which is exactly what you don't want in a Jutland battlecruiser engagement. Mostly because of torpedoes from destroyers and such. And I think even for someone like Nelson, getting the idea over to him that yes, you have your big capital ships, but these things that proportionally are even smaller than a brig compared to your capital ships are actually a mortal threat to you. That might be a little bit of a difficulty. Plus, also, long-range gunfire versus short-range rapid fire. But with that said, Nelson's probably a canny enough tactician that he will realise that. And now Nelson, fair enough, he did have some issues with, not admitting that anyone was better than him at times. He wasn't exactly the humblest of people sometimes, but he did, unlike Beatty, take his captains into his confidence, explain what he wanted to do, and listen to their feedback. So I suspect probably what would happen is Nelson would get his captains either around or by signal and say, this is roughly what I want to do if I meet the enemy fleet. What do you think? He'd get feedback from his captains, and if absolutely necessary, he might even say, okay, well, this is the plan, but I want you to lead it. Because the other thing is, remember, a lot of the time, Nelson was quite happy to delegate significant chunks of his plan to his subordinates. Collingwood was basically independently leading half the fleet at Trafalgar in line with Nelson's plan. So, given that Nelson liked to have the biggest, nastiest ships leading, he probably would have 5th Battle Squadron moved to the head of the line and tell Evan Thomas, this is what I want to do. And once everyone's kind of agreed on that it's a good idea, whatever form that plan takes, he would probably have Evan Thomas as the point man leading the detail of the fight while he gives the more general instructions and basks in the fact that Royal Navy morale has just gone up to about 300%. Brian Roper. It's 1900 and naval finances of Parliament and of US Congress are switched for the next 12 years. Oh no. What ships do the Royal Navy get out of the reduced funding, and what kind of ships does the US Navy get with looser purse strings? So 1900 to 1912, the Royal Navy gets the US Navy's budget. Well, that's horrible. I mean, the first few years, the immediate aftermath of the Spanish-American War, they might get something vaguely resembling a slightly reduced Royal Navy building program, so probably 4-ship classes of pre-dreadnoughts or something like that. But as that funding starts to die in the mid-1900s, and then Dreadnought comes out, etc., the Royal Navy is going to find itself overtaken by the German Navy and obviously the US Navy quite easily, because whilst US ships tended to be fractionally more expensive than British ships, it's not enough to afford anything much. So you're basically going to be looking at 2-ship class, 2-ship class, 2-ship class battleships, and that's pretty much all the Royal Navy can do. In fact, maybe not even that, because the Royal Navy has much greater ongoing costs than the US Navy does at that point. So in the Dreadnought race, the Royal Navy might not even be able to afford new ships. They are going to be struggling to keep the ones they have running. Whereas the US Navy, the admirals are just going to be probably just waltzing to work through waist-high mounds of dollar bills, and the US Navy ends up looking like a cage-mast version of the Grand Fleet. Wayne Borean says, Admiral, okay, so Battle of Denmark Strait is another one. Admiral Holland is in command of the 2 most upgraded at the time Queen Elizabeth class battleships, so that's Valiant and Queen Elizabeth. Assume that they came upon the 2 German ships at the same speed, or their top speed, whichever is higher. And from the point of sighting, how do you think it'll play out? Assume no golden BBs. Well, similar to what I said before, where if you had Warspite subbing in for Hood, the first thing that's going to happen realistically is the Germans are just going to outpace them, 30 knots plus versus 25. But assuming that they come across the 2 German ships at the same speed, i.e. they're travelling at somehow magically you hand-wave them up to the 30-odd, 28 to 30 knots that Hood and Prince of Wales were travelling at, it's going to go probably better for the British, because ruling out golden BBs, obviously, there's not going to be any sudden immediate explosions, and as basically similar to the previous question, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant both have modern fire control systems. At least Valiant has radar as well, modern radar as well. So although sort of QE swapping for King George V is a downgrade, for Prince of Wales is a little bit of a downgrade, if you've got 2 ships both accurately firing and ranging with 15-inch 42s, they can score hits much quicker and much earlier, which is a net advantage for them. In the long run, obviously, Bismarck still has the ability to outgun and overwhelm a single Queen Elizabeth, no matter how modernised. But if both Queen Elizabeths focus on Bismarck, that's not so much the case. The Queen Elizabeths are still more than well armoured enough to withstand anything that Prince Eugen might throw at them, and you have Norfolk and Suffolk coming along. Remember, Norfolk and Suffolk were just about getting into range at the point that Hood and Prince of Wales' engagement with Bismarck and Prince Eugen was ending. So really all they have to do, again, assuming magic hand waving of speed, is stick it out for a few more minutes than the historical battle lasted, which they can quite easily do, at which point Prince Eugen's going to be having, problems dealing with Norfolk and Suffolk, and it's 2v1 on Bismarck. So they're not going to come out of it unscathed, but 16 accurately fired 15-inch 42s is not a good idea for Bismarck to be playing against. Mason asking from last month, didn't hear it on the last live but may have missed it. What if you replaced Barents cruisers at the Battle of Barents Sea with 2 R-class and replaced Hipper with Tirpitz as Commit's flagship? How that would change the situations? To be honest, Barents Sea is actually what we're covering on the first of this year's Armchair Admirals tomorrow. That's the World of Warships live stream that I do with them. So, on paper, if Hipper's replaced with Tirpitz and Barents cruisers are replaced with 2 R-class, on paper the Germans should win the engagement, because Tirpitz is, as long as it picks its fight carefully, is more than capable of taking on one and then the other R-class. The problem you have with Barents Sea is it's such a complete and utter disaster of a mess for German command and control that, given you have situations like, a German destroyer rolling up next to a Royal Navy cruiser, thinking it's friendly and not realising that it's a British cruiser until the British cruiser starts shooting at it, there's the on paper Germans should win the fight, and there's the in keeping with Battle of Barents Sea chaos theory, which would be Tirpitz rolls up between the 2 R-class, wondering where its friends have come from, and then the R-class just bracket it. So yeah, how would it have changed the action? There would have been a lot more dead people and a lot more burning ships, but it depends on what should have happened versus what actually happened. Because yeah, Battle of Barents Sea is one of those engagements where, the saying real life is stranger than fiction because fiction has to actually make sense is very much a thing. The almighty Hypnotoad from Newfoundland asks, the Washington and First London naval treaties are not signed until 22 and 32 respectively, whilst Second London is not signed at all. Assuming that the treaties are adjusted as per the new dates whilst otherwise remaining the same, and that other world events continue as historically happened, how would the fleets of the signatories appear at the outbreak of the Second World War? Okay, so moving First London forward by a little bit doesn't actually change much, because it's just effectively a continuation and slight revision to Washington. Yes, it's going to delay and modify exactly how some ships like cruisers and destroyers are laid down, but materially, on a fleet scale, doesn't change all that much. Second London not signed at all means that for example, the restrictions on treaty battleships are still 16-inch guns rather than being downrated to 14-inch guns. So expect everybody to be trying to squeeze a quart into a pint pot and get a half-decent fast battleship on 35,000 tons with 16-inch weapons, which is going to be interesting. Trust me, the US would not have built the North Carolinas the way they did if they'd known they were going to have to put 16-inch guns on them from the start, and obviously the British the same. You might actually see the 15 King George V at that point as an attempt at balance. The biggest change is going to be moving Washington forward until presumably 1 year later in 22, because Washington talks about, ships under construction, ships that are complete, ships that are already in service, and so forth. So the Japanese will get Nagato and Mutsu in service. The Americans will probably be making arguments for all 4 Colorados. They might even be making arguments for maybe keeping a Lexington or 2. Maybe the 2 most complete Lexingtons, and turning the next 2 into carriers instead. The Japanese might, they had Tosa's hull nearly. I can see the Japanese making an argument like they did for Mutsu historically. They might make an argument to keep Tosa, which gives them 3 16-inch gunships versus the Americans with the 4 Colorados, which is an argument they might win. And then you've got the British in theory, have some G3s laid down at this point and under construction. So if you've got Atosa wandering around and you've got the Americans making maybe some arguments to keep a couple of the Lexingtons around, and they've got 4 Colorados, I can see the British making arguments along the lines of completing the 4 G3s, and at that point, if they're completing the 4 G3s, probably just dropping the 13.5-inch ships entirely. Maybe even making an argument for continued ships, but for additional vessels, because if the Americans get a couple of Lexingtons in the water, they've got 6 16-inch gunships. The British would have 4. There'd be a big argument about that. But yeah, it's going to be the capital ship end of things that's where there's going to be a lot more arguments going on. Colin Cameron, it's been suggested the Nelson should have been designed with extra room, etc., to be retrofitted with more boilers and turbines to enable them to run at 30 knots at a later date. With this being done and the ships refitted instead of Royal Oak's rebuild to allow for fast flagships to be in the fleet, while Repulse and Hood are rebuilt instead of Queen Elizabeth and Valiant, what difference would having 2 16-inch gun fast battleships and all 3 of the battlecruisers modernised make to the Royal Navy? Well, firstly, building the Nelsons with extra room to be retrofitted with more boilers and turbines, I mean, you'd need a longer ship to be able to realistically get them up to 30 knots anyway, but it would push them well over the 35,000 ton limit, even if those those spaces were empty. And you could, well, not get all the way, but maybe get a good chunk of the way if you just refitted them with modern machinery on a square foot for square foot basis. But assuming that for whatever reason people run with this and you have a pair of 30 knot Nelsons plus Renown, Repulse and Hood modernised instead of the historical modernisation process, that is going to make a huge difference, because at least the refitted Hood and refitted Nelsons are 3 additional fast battleships, and fairly powerful ones at that, on top of what the Royal Navy historically had. We know what good service Renown gave, so having another Renown in the shape of Repulse is also quite useful. If we're talking about Queen Elizabeth and Valiant and Royal Oak, I mean, Royal Oak still going to get sunk early on, so that's not going to really affect all that much in the course of the war. And Queen Elizabeth and Valiant are useful, but now presumably they're in kind of a state similar to Barham and Malaya, so significantly less so. Now that's an interesting one. I suspect, given the fact that Germany is what they're at war with first, and Germany has the Scharnhorsts plus obviously the Bismarcks as well, I suspect what you're probably going to see, I mean, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant will probably take the place of Nelson and Rodney on convoy escort duty. I can see it going one of 2 ways. I think either the Royal Navy puts all the battle cruisers together and the Nelsons together into 2 distinct sort of designated units, and then either one lot goes to the Mediterranean and the other doesn't. So they may be split up from those units, because obviously you've got things like Force H, but you might see, for example, Renown and Repulse assigned to, or Hood and one of the Renowns assigned to Admiral Cunningham, and whichever one isn't assigned to Force H, with the 2 Nelsons kept in the home fleet to keep an eye out for the Germans. Or you might see, let's say, Hood and Repulse assigned to the home fleet, Renown assigned to Force H, but with more of an eye on the Atlantic, and the 2 Nelsons sent to be Admiral Cunningham's force. The only problem is, of course, if you send a pair of 30 knotters to Admiral Cunningham and he's still got something like Warspite or the R's, those are going to be kind of drags around his feet. So possibly, maybe, especially as the King George V start coming online, maybe you have Rodney well, Nelson, given the historical deployments, probably Nelson assigned to Force H, Rodney up with the home fleet in Scapa Flow, and maybe all 3 battle cruisers get assigned, get given to Admiral Cunningham as the Mediterranean fleet's capital ships, and the various QEs get dispersed on convoy duty, plus Warspite, maybe at Force H, maybe somewhere else. Michael Laniza, I think, asks, hang on, almost sneezed. What if the US Navy in late 1944 sent Iowa and New Jersey westward as surface raiders? Would a large Japanese convoy be big enough to be a good target? And how bad would the land-based air threat be? Would the Atlanta-class have the range to come along as anti-aircraft escorts? Is there a small, fast escort group that could be put together to make this less hideously dangerous? Maybe light carriers or more anti-aircraft cruisers? Would an alternate striking group of heavy cruisers be more or less reasonable? I think if you want a self-escorting surface raiding group, and the US Navy's just gone, screw it, we're going for this anyway, maybe going after the close into mainland China, sort of Straits of Formosa style trade areas. If you're going to do that at all, then a strike group of heavy cruisers is probably, maybe with a light carrier or an Independence class light carrier or 2, is probably a more reasonable striking group, because even in late 1944, sending a couple of their most modern battleships with a relatively minimal escort, because it's going to be a long distance at high speed, that's still a fairly good way to end up losing or having badly damaged a number of your ships. Sure, it's not quite Operation Tengo with Yamato and her escorts facing off against the mass US carrier forces, but if you're going after the large Japanese convoys, maybe going after Issei and Hyuga on their runs, you're going to be in range of a lot of land-based aircraft. You're going to be at risk from reasonable numbers of Japanese submarines. It would be a huge roll of the dice. And if you're going to risk it in any way, shape, or form, you'd want to send a relatively decent cruiser screen of light cruisers, and at the very minimum, I'd say probably 2 or 3 light carriers loaded purely with fighters as a defensive group. That might be able to fight its way through and back, but it would be a hideously dangerous proposition, because you'd be one bad Japanese raid away from significant losses that you didn't need. And yeah, at that point, I mean, by late 44, the US subs are doing more than enough to rip apart Japanese merchant marine, so it's not worth the risk. Video Dude 26, alternate second naval battle of Guadalcanal, back in Drydock 88. That was a while ago. In fact, that was almost 2 years ago. I asked for an assessment of an alternate battle with Kirishima, where Washington and South Dakota were somehow replaced by Tennessee and Maryland. I'd like to revisit that and drill down on something I think got overlooked. In that scenario, Willis Lee was still aboard Washington and escorting carriers. Commander of Task Force 1 was Vice Admiral William Pye, who's somewhat ignominiously known best for being thrust into the position of Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet when Admiral Kimmel got sacked following Pearl Harbor. He wound up in charge of Task Force 1 without even making it a full month as Commander-in-Chief Pacific before he was quietly replaced by Nimitz. All that said, he was regarded in some quarters as being one of the Navy's preeminent battleship tacticians in the interwar period. Given his track record, how would Vice Admiral Pye have performed had he been able to fight with his 2 pre-war battleships? To be honest, 2 realistically, it doesn't matter how good a battleship tactician he is. Tennessee and Maryland are slow, much slower, so they're not going to be in the same tactical position. And if you're talking about late 42, they don't have anywhere near the same systems for things like radar as Washington and South Dakota do, for all the good it did South Dakota. So it's very likely that no matter how good Pai is, one, he's unlikely to actually run into the Japanese forces, period. Two, if he does, he can't get away the way that Washington did and South Dakota did, actually. Both South Dakota halfway through the battle and Washington thereafter, which is going to be a big problem. And three, he could be outfought night-wise by the Japanese on the basis of lacking the sensors. If we sort of hand-wave that Tennessee and Maryland become their late-war modernized versions, then some of that goes away because they have radar, but they're still significantly slower, and therefore the Japanese have the tactical flexibility. If they get the drop, sure, if Tennessee and or Maryland get the drop on Kirishima, it's not going to go well for Kirishima, but the key difference is that with Tennessee and Maryland, if you end up with a versus Kirishima fight, sure, Kirishima might get beaten up, but there's not an awful lot during that period that the Tennessee and Maryland can do to stop the Japanese destroyers and the cruisers circling them and long lancing them to death. Sorry, I've just noticed one of my... that's right now. I've just got a bundle of war arrows I got down from a shelf recently, and noticed one of them was missing a tip. I'm wondering if there was a random arrowhead in the floor that I'm going to step on later, and then I just realised from the shaft it's one of the blunt practice head arrows that did lose its head in a target a year or so back, so I'm not panicking anymore. Togfather. 1904, President Theodore Roosevelt has discovered a magic bunny tree and has decided that building a canal across Panama is not a sufficient monument to the greatness of the United States. If a canal connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific is to be built, it must be built across the width of the continental United States. You've been put in charge of this project. What route do you choose and why? Wow. Well, if I go anywhere across most of the continental United States, that's a long way to dig a canal. And I've got several major rivers to somehow cross, and I've got at least two entire mountain ranges to cross. So that's not happening. Let me just check a map. Because I'm basically either going to go a northern or a southern route. The southern route immediately jumps out because I don't have to go as far, albeit that in terms of canal building, it's still going to be the single largest canal project the world has ever seen. So, I mean, in theory, purely from a short distance perspective, if you say ran from San Diego, maybe vaguely following the route of what's currently I don't know whether it's route or interstate, but if you kind of follow the California and then into Arizona and New Mexico, so sort of San Diego to Tucson, is it Tucson, I think, and then running down to sort of San Antonio or Houston and then out into the Gulf of Mexico, that's still a monstrously large canal, but it's only about half as long as what I need to do otherwise. There's a few geographic problems to overcome in that case, not the least of which is the fact I'm going through a bunch of desert, so the chances are it's probably going to evaporate halfway. The other alternative, somehow doing it along the Canadian border, maybe expand... I mean, the problem is that the St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes, okay, some form of canal system linking all the Great Lakes is, in this world of insanity, is less insane than trying to do a 2-lane capital ship capable canal through the Arizona desert. But you're going to run into the problem that the St. Lawrence River very much kicks off into Canada rather than anywhere else, just east of Lake Ontario. So unless I sign a really, really nice treaty with the Canadians, I don't think I'm getting that. I mean, there's like bits of lake and stuff that I can link up going west of Lake Superior, but then I'm going to run into how to get across, North Dakota, Montana, Idaho, and Washington to get to the Pacific. And yeah, there's, at least if I'm reading this map right, there are some fairly significant mountains in the way there. Yeah, and that's, even that, quote-unquote, relatively shortened section still involves even more canal work than going across the south. So, I mean, I don't think it could be done, but if I'd be stuck. To be perfectly honest, if building a canal across the United States territories itself, I mean, I'd be tempted to just cheat and go, okay, we're going to formally annex some random part of Central America if I'm forbidden from using Panama, and just go do that instead, because that's going to be orders of magnitude easier. That's pretty much all I can think of, because engineering wise, short of nuclear weapons, I can't see any particular way of crossing the continental United States with a canal. Can you imagine a tunnel through the Appalachians or the Rockies big enough to fit a battleship? Well, 2 battleships, because you'd need a canal going either way. Because can you imagine the transit times if you're waiting in the Pacific side and you only have 1 canal, and someone's just entered from the East Coast, please remain here for a month or more while it slowly transitions its way across the US. Yeah, Matt Dixon pointed out it'd be easier to find a way to put them on wheels and roll them across, as what was it, Popular Mechanics, I think, had that as an idea at one point. Helena von Kellendrast asks, Tegetthoff-class as battle cruisers. Austria-Hungary decides to build its prestige ships as battle cruisers instead of battleships. So they order 4 to the specifications as follows: 23,000 tons, 25.5 knot top speed, 11-inch belt, 9 12-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 2 forward, 1 aft. Secondary battery, 12 casement mounted 6-inch guns. Assuming these ships are finished roughly in line with the original ships, if they had sorted in support of Goeben, how do you think these versions of the Tegetthoff and Virbus Unitis would have fared in battle against Invincible and Indomitable? And if they hadn't sorted, how do you think 3 fast capital ships in the Adriatic would have changed Entente deployments in the Mediterranean and North Sea in 1916? By 1916, I don't think it's going to change all that much, because by 1916 you've got various French and Italian dreadnoughts facing off against them, and the Adriatic isn't exactly the world's widest stretch of water. So much as the Russians were vaguely happy, at least for as long as it lasted, with Imperatricia Maria facing off against Goeben, even though one was a dreadnought, one was a battlecruiser, with Dante Alighieri and the Corbeys and so forth blocking up the Adriatic, whether the Tegetthoffs are battle cruisers or dreadnoughts isn't going to make a great deal of difference in 1916. But earlier in the support of Goeben role, if you take these 2 theoretical ships up against Invincible and Indomitable, in theory they stand a pretty good chance of beating them straight up, because speed is near enough of makes no difference, roughly the same. They've got almost twice the armor belt, so they actually have meaningful protection to a degree against 12-inch guns, certainly at the longer ranges and the upper portion of mid-range. They've got an extra 12-inch gun compared to the Invincible and Indomitable per ship, and with 3 triple turrets laid out in the sort of World War II style 2-4-1 aft, they can bring all those guns to bear on most reasonable bearings, as opposed to the British ships, which are really 6-gun ships on most bearings. So, assuming that alternate Tegetthoff and the other one, go off against an Invincible and an Indomitable, Goban presumably is probably going to double back and help out, so that will be a fairly clear Central Powers victory. Ed Schaller, if reactive armour had been discovered before World War I, would it be used on capital ships, and how might that have altered World War I and World War II? No. No, it wouldn't be. Because, well, basically it comes down to, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. One of Newton's wonderful laws. Reactive armour on modern tanks, and slightly older than modern tanks, can be a thing because you're quote-unquote only dealing with things like 120, 125mm guns, i.e. 4 inches, 4.4 and 4-point-something inch caliber weapons, i.e. destroyer-grade guns. The square cube law means that when you get up to capital ship scale, even quote-unquote only 12-inch guns, the weight of the shells coming in, the mass of the shells coming in, basically the amount of metal, as opposed to tank shells, especially things like high explosive anti-tank shells and such, is just so much greater that in order to get reactive armor that would have any real appreciable effect on an incoming 12, 13.5 or 15-inch round, you'd be strapping so much explosive to the outside of your ship that people might as well just sail up with an old Nordenfelt, and then you'd blow yourself up, because you... reactive armor, I put it this way, reactive armor on a battleship scale is effectively wearing a suicide vest of nitroglycerin and asking the other guy to shoot you with a BB gun. Or a real rifle, for that matter. It's like, yes, technically you might be able to stop the incoming round. Practically, you are going to regret that decision. Megascrow, you have a shipyard at the end of World War II. Countries are scaling down their navies and send you some ships for scrapping. What a shame, you think, when one of the ships sails in, and you turn it into an ocean liner or cruise ship, fully demilitarized, no guns, no fire control, belt armor, etc. What ship, how would it look, and could it be a success commercially? Any navy, any ship afloat, January 1st, 1946, and if not a cruise ship, what other civilian ship would you make out of it? Okay, so any ship that might conceivably be being scrapped on January the 1st, 1946, and I get to try and turn it into an ocean liner cruise ship, presumably for the minimal amount of cost. That's going to be Saratoga, because she's the biggest thing I'm likely to get my hands on. As a carrier, I'm not going to have to strip out anywhere near as much equipment. I mean, there's a reason some liners were converted into carriers. This is kind of a weird inverse of that, and she never was a liner because she was a battlecruiser, but compared to turning a battleship, which is a relatively low-volume vessel compared to a carrier, into a cruise liner, or, I mean, even a cruiser, this thing is huge. I've got relatively minimal armor to strip off, and I can take off the flight deck and stick a bit of a superstructure on top, and near enough ready to go. I mean, even if I can somehow finagle it so that I can get a superstructure over the hangar deck somehow, details to be determined, that might even prove to be a particularly spectacular attraction, because think of the possibilities of a Lexington-sized cruise liner where instead of, maybe the biggest room being a ballroom or something, you've got an almost end-to-end aircraft carrier hangar-sized room. You could have, like a full-on athletics facilities there, like tennis courts, sprinting tracks, running tracks, swimming pools, everything, and still not occupy all the space. Probably have a flipping arboretum somewhere. And little transits. You could even have a little tramway, public transit tramway going up and down. That would be quite fun. And yeah, and to be perfectly honest, some people might actually, yeah. I kind of wish they'd done that now. I like that idea. Reaver, did the British or other notable navies, if you have the information handy, provide different meals in their sailing ships for Christmas and related holidays? If not, what and when did they start to accommodate more than the barest of logistical practicalities? Where possible, especially with things like Christmas, some alternate food was provided, but it was very hit and miss for the age of sail. Because, excuse me. That's it. So with the age of sail, you could be out for months at a time. You have no real idea when you're going to get resupplied or where you're going to have to be able to put in for resupplies. And no one's going to go to the difficulty or expense of keeping enough food for the entire crew to have a specific special Christmas meal if they're going to have to store it in some tiny corner of the ship for half a year. But on the other hand, if someone looks at the calendar and goes, oh, it's the 22nd of December, and we've pulled into, I don't know, somewhere in in sort of Asia or America or wherever, somewhere you can get something unusual, then sure, at that point the captain might go, well, Christmas is coming up, let's get some fresh food for Christmas apart from anything else. That would probably go down as much of a treat as anything, but it would be entirely down to the captains at that point. As far as when and where do people start to accommodate things like Christmas and various other holidays, it's largely down to when ships get more predictable, which is when refrigeration comes in, steamships coming in, i.e. the latter part of the 19th century, because then you can and tinned food and refrigerated food, because that allows you to then not quite put things in stasis, but effectively go, right, this is a specific lot of food we want for this specific date, we know we're going to be out at this specific time, and we can store it and have a reasonable proposition that the thing's still going to be intact when we want to eat it. And then things develop on from there. Paul asks, at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Admiral Spruance expressed concern about a multi-pronged attack devised to get behind American lines and attack the transports. The Japanese plan, however, was less concerned with the landings, more concerned with engaging in decisive battle. At Leyte Gulf, Halsey was set on fighting a carrier battle, while the actual Japanese plan was, of course, a multi-pronged assault designed to draw off the US fleet. So Halsey and Spruance seem to have fought the battle the other was prepared for. How do you think Halsey and Spruance would have performed if they'd been put in place of the other? Okay, so... So Halsey at Philippine Sea... to be honest, probably might have gone slightly worse. I mean, when you look at Philippine Sea, a good chunk of the US losses in terms of aircraft and pilots are because of that sort of the last long range assault, and then the planes having to come back at night when they've not got night landing training, and they're low on fuel. Carriers are having to switch their lights on in order to try and get some of the aircraft back. The outcome in terms of dealing with the Japanese might well be very similar, but the casualties in exchange, Halsey might be tempted to throw even more into those late actions compared to Spruance, which might then cost the US more for the same victory. On the other hand, Spruance at Leyte Gulf, if he is obviously concerned about multi-prong attack, Task Force 34 is going to be left in place at San Bernardino Strait, and we've done a video on how that would turn out. So yeah, I think given their tactics, I think Spruance would have done a lot better than Halsey in terms of both destruction of enemy assets and protection of his own at Leyte Gulf. Halsey probably would have got as much or more decisive a victory against the Japanese at Philippine Sea, but it would have come at a much higher cost to the US Navy. Kuma Flame War, Yamato counterfactual. If the Japanese decide not to throw Yamato and other surface units away during the invasion of Okinawa, instead they withdraw the units to Japan awaiting the invasion, if she is intact at the end of the war and salvageable in shallow water, what would the US do with her? Would she be considered too capable to be sunk as part of nuclear tests? Is there a chance she would have been preserved as a war trophy or something else? I don't think they've got Musashi as kind of a benchmark for how durable the Yamato class is, so they're probably not going to use her in conventional testing of weapons. I think, to be honest, they probably are still going to use her as a nuclear test target, largely on the grounds that she's the biggest battleship in existence at that point. She's very heavily protected, so she's kind of almost makes an ideal target for the nuclear test, because it's a way of sort of going, right, well, if we have any ideas about building battleships in the future, or if anyone else has any ideas about building battleships in the future, using this very heavily armed large battleship as our benchmark, what would the nuclear effects be on such a vessel? To see, if the Russians, say, restarted Sovietsky Soyuz or some improved their version thereof, how would our nukes affect it? So I genuinely think she'd end up at crossroads. Although perhaps they might put her, certainly for Able, they'd probably put her at a mid-range, just so they could also then see what happens with Baker. Apologies, it's a bit dusty here today. And Mrs. Drac was kind enough to bring me some tissues. Admiral Tiberius. It's 1940, France is collapsing, but unlike in our timeline, the French Navy is prepared to fight on, having been motivated by the example of the other smaller free navies. It's already shipped significant resources, assets and supplies to British ports. What kind of impact could it have had on the war in the Atlantic, Mediterranean and Pacific if most of the French Navy, both old and new, and its supplies, was evacuated to friendly ports and refused surrender or collaboration orders? So, I've discussed I've discussed elements of this in the past with other questions. The biggest single possibility of that is Richelieu, if they patch her together in time, Richelieu perhaps taking the point instead of Hood in the Battle of Denmark Strait. Now, whether that's Richelieu leading Hood, or whether that's Richelieu and Prince of Wales being sent out, or maybe Richelieu, Prince of Wales and Hood being sent out, it would give us a Richelieu versus Bismarck fight, which would be absolutely hilarious. And I think, assuming they've noticed some of the problems with the French 15-inch shells, that Richelieu has a pretty decent chance of winning. In terms of the rest of the French Navy, I think in the early part of the war, you would probably see Dunkirk and... So we're talking about... Well, this is post-Norway. So Dunkirk and Strasbourg would probably be paired up and used in the Atlantic during things like, say, Operation Berlin, when the Scharnhorsts are out raiding. So Dunkirk and Strasbourg would probably be paired up and sent out as a unit trying to hunt down one or the other of the Scharnhorsts. Later, Italy's getting involved in the war as well, so I suspect a number of the French heavy cruisers and a bunch of their destroyers are probably going to be in the Mediterranean theatre. The older French battleships and such like are going to be convoy escorts in various places. But yeah, I think you're gonna see Dunkirk and Strasbourg on raider hunting duty in the Atlantic. The newer French cruisers, Algerie, etc., and destroyers are probably going to be reinforcing the Mediterranean theatre. Richelieu fighting Bismarck. Once Bismarck is down and the Scharnhorsts and Prince Eugen have made a runner back to Germany, assuming that both Scharnhorsts survive an encounter with, or one of them survives an encounter with Dunkirk and Strasbourg, which is potentially unlikely, then I can see Richelieu being retained for a while as a fast capital ship in the home fleet. Dunkirk and Strasbourg may very well be then sent into the Mediterranean to help pile the pressure on the Italians, because, unless it's a Littorio, Dunkirk and Strasbourg, especially Strasbourg, is more than capable of standing up to almost anything else that the Italians might have. Given their differing levels of armour, Strasbourg might be seconded to Cunningham. Dunkirk might stay with Force H, running more of an escort as opposed to Strasbourg running an offensive duty. And then, the thing is, at that point, you start to get butterflies of quite significant proportion. So even by late 41, once you get the Japanese entering the war, exactly how the war in the Mediterranean is going might be very different. If the Germans are down at least one Scharnhorst, maybe sort of ideal scenario, Scharnhorst runs into Dunkirk and Strasbourg, then Gneisenau gets hit in dock, so the Germans only have Tirpitz left by the time the Japanese are fully into the war. Then that changes a fair bit, because then that changes everything for both the Royal Navy and the new Free French Navy. But I would suspect that even if we assume for whatever reason the war roughly goes the way we see it going in World War II anyway, just for the sake of having a scenario we can build on, then the British are probably going to be more confident about dispatching capital ships to the Far East. So ABDA command, instead of having Prince of Wales and Repulse, the British might think they can spare a few additional capital ships. The Free French will probably... there's French Indochina being taken by the Japanese. The Free French might want to go and have a crack at the Japanese, but I suspect they might also want to just stay around closer to home, closer to mainland France. I think that would be kind of determining the force allocations for 42, 43 onwards would be... obviously Richelieu historically does eventually go out with the Eastern Fleet, but for the kind of mid-war period, if the Free French forces decide, actually, we want to stay closer to mainland France and fight Germany and Italy, then the French forces basically take up some of the slack that the British historically did, and more British forces are sent to the Eastern Fleet, which the Americans would be very happy about. Alternatively, if they decide that the Japanese taking French Indochina is enough of an issue that they also want to fight there, then at that point, given that the Japanese broadly are going around with a lot of fast ships, I think then there will still be an increased Allied presence in the Far East, but it will probably be a case of what the British deployed historically, with maybe a little bit more, but also a substantial Free French presence, because things like Richelieu, the Dunkirks, and then more modern destroyers and cruisers are all quite fast, whereas the British have a mixture of ships and they prefer to hold the fort. So it would be interesting. For flip's sake. Sorry, that's my phone. Let me put that on mute. There we go. Daniel Silverthorne asks, had USS Nevada been designed and built using 3 triple 14-inch turrets instead of the existing arrangement, twins over triples, how might this have altered US naval ship design going forward? Would US ships have had a higher speed in later variations of the standards, realising that the smaller armoured citadel of the arrangement would allow for better weight savings when combined with the all-or-nothing scheme introduced in the Nevada class, or would they simply have added a 4th turret as they did for the Pennsylvanias? Also, can you go into more detail on the actual advances, if any, between the various steps in the US standards, or were they literally just follow-ons of the preceding classes with slight differences in the arrangement of equipment? So a 3 triple Nevada design, I suspect, probably isn't going to change all that much, because, again, got 9 guns instead of 10, slightly smaller citadel. But given the pressure of cost savings that the US is facing when they're building the Nevadas, I suspect they probably, especially with things like Secretary Daniels, they probably would have just gone, you know what, we can get good firepower on a slightly smaller ship, and the Nevadas therefore would have just been a bit smaller. And then the rest of the standards, it would have just, add another triple 14-inch gun and a gun turret, and off we go. So I don't think it would have changed all that much in that case, unfortunately, because the US is under such budgetary pressure, and the US Navy is under such budgetary pressure when it comes to those kind of design considerations. Although they probably would have noted the efficiencies of a 3 triple turret design for later. So I think if there's going to be a design impact anywhere, it might be when you get to something like the Colorados, or actually, well, to be honest, the Tennessees, considering the US wanted them with 16-inch guns. You might then see people floating designs for a 3 triple 16 Tennessee, and if that gets kicked back and the Tennessees get built as 14-inch ships as historically, then you might see the Colorados being built as 3 triple 16 instead of 4 twin 16. That's something I can see the US Navy potentially going for. But as far as the actual advances in the various stages of the US Standard class, I mean, there's changes in machinery. Nevada and Oklahoma, you're still looking at experiments with vertical triple expansion, and then you go over to turbo electric drive. You've got improvements in sea keeping as time goes on. And some of the hull designs to improve sea keeping is one of the reasons I really like the New Mexicos over their predecessors. You eventually get cage masts that won't fall over in rough weather, which is why, for example, the Colorados still have them in the start of World War II. It's just, it turns out, to make a cage mast that's heavy enough to be worthwhile, it ends up being far heavier than a tripod, so the whole thing's kind of pointless, except for the expense of ripping them all down. What else have you got? You've also got, there's an improvement in the guns, so about halfway through the if you like, the proper standard class, there's a new variant of the 14-inch gun, which is more powerful, which is quite funny because obviously all of the 14-inch guns are updated in the interwar World War II period, so you've effectively got 4 sets of performance characteristics for the 14-inch guns on the standard battleships when you're considering their full run from the early 1910s through to 1945, and changes in little changes in position of secondary batteries, exact location of armor layout, and so on and so forth. They're not, they're mostly incremental designs, incremental design changes. But I mean, it does build up. So if you compare, say, the first of the 4-turret standards, the Pennsylvanias, compare those to the Tennessees, there's quite a bit of difference between the two. But when you then look at the ships that come in between, you can actually see how it's a general follow-on. And of course, towards the end, they're also improving things quite significantly in terms of torpedo protection. But, I mean, to go through the full standard class development history is its own video, to be honest. Mark AG, PQ-17 alternate history. If the Kriegsmarine come out with Tirpitz, Scharnhorst, Lutzow, Scheer and Hipper along with their 12 destroyers, and the Royal... sorry. This force is spotted and reported. Tovey decides he wants to get in a few rounds, so you've got King George V, Washington, Victorious, Cumberland, Nigeria, and their 9 destroyers to intercept the force, and calls in London, Norfolk, Wichita, Tuscaloosa, and the 4 destroyers from the convoy cruiser force. How does this scenario play out realistically? And follow up, if it doesn't realistically result in battle being joined, how would this battle play out if battle were to be joined? So if the Kriegsmarine is going all in and sending this force, well, there has to be a fairly heavy motivation for it. But historically, when they were faced with the idea of being intercepted by enemy air power, they did withdraw. So I guess it comes down to Victorious, really. If Victorious can get off a reasonable number of aircraft, there's a chance, especially depending on also how successful those aircraft are, there's a chance the Kriegsmarine might go, maybe not, and go home again. But if Victorious gets in airstrikes that are either not particularly effective, or the Kriegsmarine just decides, you know what, stuff it, we're going for it, and as you say, battle is joined, the Allies do have a significant advantage. If they've joined up their forces, either King George V or Washington should be able to reasonably happily take on Tirpitz one-on-one. But Scharnhorst versus either King George V or Washington is a very uneven contest. I mean, we know Duke of York obviously beat Scharnhorst. And so in the capital ship engagement, the odds are tilted in the Allies' favour. They, of course, also have air support in the form of Victorious. Depending on exactly where the battle takes place, there may be some long-range Luftwaffe aircraft that can come to play, but Victorious will have fighters up and the Luftwaffe won't. So it's more than likely that the only air support in the vicinity is likely to be Allied. So the Allied ships can be told, right, keep your anti-aircraft guns silent, let our aircraft do their thing, and Victorious probably will be targeting Tirpitz and Scharnhorst to help out King George V and Washington. So the battleship fight is well slanted in the Allies' favour. If you've got London, Norfolk, Wichita and Tuscaloosa, plus Cumberland, so you've got 5 heavy cruisers versus Lutzow, Scheer and Hipper. Okay, now Lutzow and Scheer have 11-inch guns, but 5-3, and we're talking full-blooded heavy cruisers here, not Exeter. Then again, the Allies have quite a decisive advantage. Nigeria kind of has a floating role, I guess, at that point. It could just join in the dogpile on Lutzow, Scheer and Hipper if it wanted to. But given the odds, I'd be more tempted to use Nigeria as a kind of giant destroyer leader, form up with the other 13 destroyers, and then you've got a town class, well, not a town class, a crown colony class, plus a flotilla effectively of destroyers versus a German destroyer flotilla. That's probably the closest to a thing to an even fight there's going to be, but in terms of destroyer versus destroyer. But if you put Nigeria in, that's going to be a big force balancing favourite of the Allies. So yeah, I mean, realistically, the Germans, you're talking about a scenario where the Germans are committing everything, and really when they tended to commit big in that period of the war, they tended to suddenly get very nervous about if they saw the possibility of losing big and would withdraw. So realistically, they're going to do that. But if battle is joined, odds are the Allies have a significant advantage in pretty much all of the various fields. You know, they've got a firepower advantage in battleships, they've got a firepower advantage in cruisers, they've got a firepower advantage in destroyers, and they can play with their forces to increase that, and they have the wild card of the aircraft carrier. Now, that's not to say the Germans won't get to kill or badly damage Allied ships. It's not that one-sided, so there probably will be losses on the Allied side, but it is going to be ultimately either the Germans withdraw or the Germans get defeated in detail. Ferris, suppose for whatever reason the Kido Butai squares off against the Regia Marina. How does either side fare, assuming the action takes place in the Mediterranean? The Regia Marina loses quite badly. I mean, even if we go for... Well, the thing is, the Regia Marina is either... If you go early war, when they have their refits done, then they don't have Roma, and if you're being really generous... And if you go late war, when they have Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, and Roma, so they've got the three Littorios, they don't have some of their refits. But ultimately, it is a numbers game. The Regia Marina has no carriers, assuming that it's the whole of the Japanese fleet. Well, I suppose it depends how you're interpreting it. If you're saying the Kido Butai in terms of the Japanese carrier fleet, that's somewhat different. If it's the Japanese fleet, the Japanese have far more battleships. They've got the Yamatos, they've got far more cruisers, they've got far more destroyers. They just swarm the Regia Marina. If it's the Kido Butai specifically, well, I mean, even then, what time period are we talking about? Are we talking about the Kido Butai at the time of Pearl Harbor? So you've got 6 carriers, but they also have a heavy escort. Are we talking the Kido Butai at the time of Operation Sea, where they have the Congos with them but slightly fewer carriers? Are we talking about the Kido Butai at the Battle of Midway, where they have a reasonable number of carriers and the distant forces they have with them include Yamato? But, I mean, and even if we just drill it down to purely the carrier force, and they've only got anti-aircraft escorts, i.e. cruisers and destroyers, I mean, the Mediterranean's a bit of a close confine area for carrier operations en masse, the way the Japanese would like to do them, but they do have the range, so even if it's a purely 6 carrier Kido Butai versus a Regia Marina, the main problem the Italians are going to have, even if there's no Japanese capital ships present, is that the Japanese can launch mass strikes and torpedo and bomb them to their heart's content, and there's not a tremendous amount the Italians can do because they've got such a long distance to cover. The Kido Butai can be long gone by the time they get there, and they can just keep hitting them with aircraft. So yeah, it's a fairly decisive Japanese advantage. Robert Henry Ilston asks, could you discuss the advantages or disadvantages of timber sources that timber sources had for the construction of Age of Sail vessels, i.e. teak versus English oak versus American white oak? Were there statistical advantages to particular timber construction, and how did this influence various Navy ship designs? I think I've answered a question similar to this recently. But, I mean, broadly speaking, it was down to what could you get access to, because you can buy timber in from other nations at times, especially mast timber. There's a huge trade in that, especially from the Baltic regions. But when you're talking about the timber sources for the hulls, the sheer amount of timber that you need to build frigates and ships of the line for their hulls is such that it's not really realistic to import that timber any great distance. So you make do with what you've got locally, which is why, Spanish ships built in the Caribbean could be built of mahogany. British ships built in India could be built of teak. British ships built in the UK could be made of oak. American ships obviously could be made of white oak or live oak or a combination thereof. Or if you're needing to build them quickly, out of green pine. Lots of people did that when it came down to rush builds. The differences in the durability of the timber, there's not enough of an advantage in those to have a statistical difference like Harvey versus Krupp steel. There are some timbers that are better and stronger for ships, but those are the ones that are chosen locally anyways. You choose your best timber for your warships. Obviously there's some secondary issues, like you really do not want teak splinters if you end up in a gunfight stuck in you. Oak splinters stuck in you is bad enough. Teak splinters are infinitely worse because of the properties of teak wood. And they did like things like teak decking where they could get their hands on it because of its durability. Particularly when it came to how it acted with sort of rain and other forms of weather. But whilst white oak or live oak is definitively and measurably somewhat tougher than your average oak, except for outside cases, it's still not going to help you that much if you get broadsided at close range by 32 pounder and 24 pounder cannon shot. So, as I mentioned in a previous Drydock, you do get situations, like Constitution getting the nickname Old Ironsides because she's a fairly heavy. But the thing is, you've got to remember she's a very heavily built frigate, not quite ship of the line scale, but almost, using some of the tougher woods, and she's up against ships firing what, for the age of sail, are, relatively speaking, lighter guns. So it's a very particular set of circumstances which lead to some shots bouncing off her hull or embedding themselves in her hull. Not all. And, look at any decent summary of the battles that various American large frigates fight, including Constitution, or the detailed reports submitted, and you'll notice that, say, in the aftermath of the battles with Guerriere, Java, or Macedonian, one of the first things that the American ship does is not take the surrender straight away, but actually haul off for a bit to make repairs. And that includes, when you look at the various bills and descriptions, repairs to the hull, because even 18 pounder shot at close range, roughly perpendicular, will go through live oak or white oak just as happily as it'll go through English oak. It's the longer range and more angled shots where there's a bit of protection going on there. So how did it influence various Navy ship designs? Not tremendously, because whether you're using mahogany, teak, oak, or various species of oak, it's all within the range when it comes to sailing ship design. It's more, in terms of wood availability, it's more of kinds of wood used for specific elements of the ship. So you use your oak and or locally available hardwoods for your hull, where the availability of timber probably has a more noticeable effect is on things like mast timber and deck timber, because those have very specific requirements. The wood that will make very good mast timber will make horrible hull material, and vice versa. Robin McFarlane asks, concrete or cement armour used on merchant ships during World War II. What is it? According to my dad, it was very good, but I remember very little of what he said. So there were some experiments with concrete or cement armour used on merchant ships, but the most widely deployed form of quote-unquote armour for merchant ships was similar but not exactly the same. It was the kind of tarmac-style armour, asphalt armour, which is something I've covered in a previous Drydock, which was basically, relatively speaking, cheap and easy to cast slabs that could give you protection from shell fragments, strafing, machine gun rounds, that kind of thing. You're not going to be able to build up with concrete, cement or asphalt on a merchant ship any realistic thickness of armour where you can fight it out with a surface raider, but you can make the crude areas of your ships far more survivable against as I said, shrapnel, blast, and machine gun fire. Occasionally, as I said, before the asphalt type armour got properly codified, concrete and cement blocks and bags and such could be used in place of or instead of. And yeah, it was pretty good because against the threats that the merchantmen faced, at least the majority of the threats they faced, it was very good at increasing their survivability, whatever form it took. That's the merchantmen, the merchant sailors themselves, because unlike warships, the threats to most merchantmen, especially in things like the Battle of the Atlantic, tend to be either relatively speaking, minor threats like shrapnel and machine gun fire, or incoming large shells and torpedoes, at which point no amount of armour is going to do you much good. We're nearly done with the Patreon questions, which is good. How far are we doing? 2 hours. It's not too bad to answer all this lot. Warren Jervey, back in 2019, you did a video on a trip to an Amsterdam Naval Museum, which appeared to be a post-trip video. Yes, the one I went to Den Helder. The video hinted there might be an additional program based on the additional material of the actual museum trip itself. Yes. During the film, did anything further come of this project, and if so, where can one view the product? So, yes, I went to Den Helder. Yes, I did get a bunch of picture footage. Unfortunately, it turned out I brought the wrong DSLR battery with me, so my DSLR died relatively early in the day, so I wasn't able to get much, if any, video footage. But the staff at Den Helder, particularly the rather wonderful ex-Royal Dutch Navy gentleman who was my guide for the day, they were absolutely superb. And that's why you haven't seen any subsequent videos from them. And this is something I've covered in a relatively recent live stream as well. So my general principle when it comes to, if I go somewhere and I film there, and the staff, the facility, whatever it happens to be, have helped me out, I want to make sure that any video I produce does as reasonable as it can be, as much good for them as it does for me. And as you mentioned, that was a 2019 trip. So by the time I'd gotten ready to do videos on the Den Helder Museum, videos on at least two, possibly three of the ships they've actually got there. Obviously the for me unpronounceable Dutch ship that pretended to be an island to escape the Japanese, and the Scorpion, which is much easier to pronounce, an ironclad ram vessel. I actually have those scripts ready to go, incorporating the pictures and what limited video I was able to get off of them. But clues in the date, obviously towards the end of 2019 and early 2020 we had the pandemic, travel restrictions, etc., etc. So producing those videos in early 2020 or any part of 2020 or 2021, sure, they would have gotten me plenty of views, but they wouldn't have done the Den Helder Museum much good because, at times they wouldn't have been open, and at other times, even if you watched it and you thought, I'd like to go, you probably couldn't because of the travel restrictions, even if they were open. So I've held on to that material the same way I've held on to material from Jersey, when I went on the trip there, material from Gibraltar, material from Chatham dockyards. I've got loads of material from all of those ready to be put together into videos. And I've held on to that because I want to now produce those videos, probably starting either produce them maybe in late March starting with release while I'm in the States, or possibly when I get back from the States, and release those during the spring and summer of this year, because spring and summer of this year, at least so far, it looks like if you want to visit all of those places, you can. Because let's face it, if I published a video on the Den Helder Museum in the middle of 2020, you might have gone, yeah, I really, really want to visit that. But realistically, would you have remembered that by now? Or would you have remembered that by 3-4 months from now, if it had been 2 years earlier? Whereas if I release those videos in spring, summer this year, then people will hopefully see them, and some of you might go, yeah, I'm going to go and see those ships in real life, at which point the museum benefits. So that's a slightly long-winded way of saying why I haven't produced any videos on that trip yet, because the conditions of the past few years haven't been such that I can produce them and in good conscience, have as much reasonable benefit as practical to the people who kindly helped me get that content in the first place. Patrick Donnelly, would Admiral Halsey need to change to another ship if New Jersey was deployed as part of Task Force 34? Yeah, probably. If so, what ship? My money is on Enterprise. Possibly Enterprise. I think it would depend on exactly what Task Force 34 is made up of. Because if you remember when I did the video on what would happen if Task Force 34 had been there, I posited that 2 of the battleships wouldn't have made it because they were too far away at the time for the scenario that we'd come up with. So given that the carriers would have been even further away, I think you've got one of 2 scenarios. Either all the battleships are assigned to Task Force 34, in which case, yes, Halsey would probably need to switch to something like Enterprise, or you get a Task Force 34 that's kind of like the one I posited in that particular video, at which point Halsey would probably switch over to one of the 2 battleships that's not present. Dr. D.M. Platt. Hypothetically, if you could place 12 spies with full radio communication gear to share information and observation, as well as the ability to talk and be heard by the fleet commander, where would you place them to most significantly affect the battle during the Battle of Jutland and another battle of your choice? Okay, so this is spies on the enemy fleet, and they can communicate with Jellicoe. Well, obviously, having them on the bridge of... Basically, having them on the bridge of Lutzow and Friedrich de Grosser, I think, was where Scheer was, off the top of my head. But basically, on Hipper and Scheer's flagships bridges would be the 2 obvious places to put them. Because at that point, the spy could just have their radio on open mic transmission, and Jellicoe knows roughly what all the decisions that are being made on the 2 enemy fleet flagships are, which would be great. If you're going to distribute the spies further, if I'm obviously using hindsight, then maybe put one on Seydlitz. Or if you've got 12, you might as well then put one on Seydlitz. You've got two on the flagships, and then put one on the squadron flagship of each of the German battle squadrons. Where else? I mean, that's probably most of what you need. And maybe 1 or 2 on the German cruiser and destroyer flotillas that led part of the night action. Although, if you've got spies on all the German squadron flagships and their full flagships, you're probably going to have changed Jutland so much the night action maybe doesn't even happen. And in terms of another battle of your choice, where you can put spies with radio communication gear on the enemy fleet's ships, I'd be half tempted to be honest, at that point, I'd be half tempted to just stick them all on Bismarck and Prince Eugen in the run-up to Denmark Strait, because if they're then able to communicate with Admiral Holland, then he will know where Bismarck and Prince Eugen are, which means you might get the night action close-range engagement that Admiral Holland wanted, which would be a very, very interesting fight to see happen, rather than the daytime engagement that we know. Goose Riesbos asks, in the spirit of the holidays, what are some fun or interesting Christmas traditions that you came across in different navies? To be honest, and to be perfectly honest, I do apologise because it's not going to be much of an answer. I don't really know that much about Christmas traditions in the various navies. It is a bit more of the social manpower side of things, which, whilst I look at times, I don't tend to look at anywhere near as much as technical specs battles and that kind of thing, development histories, infrastructure. So, I know I've seen in passing reference to various Christmas traditions, meals, etc., etc. But off the top of my head, I can't really recall a lot of the details. Not that I've read that many. The only thing that does immediately come to mind is a number of photos and captions and descriptions of the fact that obviously one of the things, and this applies somewhat more generally on ships as well, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, but to a degree also in earlier periods, which is that for entertainment purposes, quite often ships would put on plays, which of course in Christmas time might be nativity plays or something like that. But on warships of that time period, you do have something of a problem of the ships are full of men, and well, a nativity play needs, well, it needs a Mary, it needs a baby Jesus, which you probably, actually might find a few of them on sailing vessels, ships of the line and such like, but you're probably not going to find one on a late 19th, early 20th century warship. And you also need angels, and with the best will in the world, most sailors would be very hard-pressed to pull off a half-decent, at least classical mythology-style angel. One or two of them might be ugly enough to pull off a biblically accurate angel. Eyes everywhere, 6 wings made of fire, that kind of stuff. But anyway, there were those obvious issues, but a lot of ships would, especially the larger ones, would try and put on that kind of play. And obviously, outside of the Christmas period, lots of other plays as well, where the crew, or selected elements of the crew, would cross-dress and pretend to be, to have obviously men pretending to be women. Maybe some of the smaller midshipmen could pretend to be the children or the babies, that kind of thing. So I do remember seeing a photo of a nativity scene where Mary has a beard, which is slightly bizarre, and also the baby Jesus is like 16, which is slightly weird, but also amusing. Jake Miller used the cat. Yes, let us wrap the ship's cat, the vicious rat-killing cat. Let us wrap it in bandages and try and stuff it in a wicker basket. Well, I know someone who's spending Christmas in the medical bay. Oh, it'd be funny to watch, though. Brian Smith, if Enterprise and Hornet had been and able to make it to the Coral Sea in time, and this led to the Americans having a Midway-style victory, I thinking all the Japanese carriers, would that have changed their plans for the attack on Midway? Yes and no. The Japanese carriers that are present at the Battle of Midway broadly are not the carriers that are present at Coral Sea, so there's technically nothing that prevents the Japanese from launching Midway anyway, but the fact that they've potentially have lost Coral Sea quite decisively would probably lead to a re-evaluation of their tactics, which would change the plans for the attack on Midway. Exactly how, I don't entirely, obviously because it's very difficult to actually predict, but it could range from anything from we need to double down on Midway because we need to redress the balance, to we don't do Midway at all, to we do something slightly different. Excuse me. So yeah, it could be all over the place. Introvert asks, you've been transported back in time to 1945. At the end... Oh, that's another Elbonian Navy question. Okay. I'm going to have to put the Elbonian Navy questions in a separate Drydock because I've done so many of those blasted things already. I'll do that next week. Chris Gregory, given the date, what are some of the more interesting ways the navies have celebrated holidays at sea? Again, this kind of falls back to the Christmas question that was earlier, because obviously this is the December-January question period. So I refer you to my previous question about celebrating Christmas at sea. In terms of other holidays, I mean, obviously warships have a ready supply of explosives, so US ships celebrating Independence Day can be quite entertaining, especially in World War II. But yeah, again, unfortunately it is this kind of very much the social practices side of things, which is not something I'm particularly au fait with as compared to other stuff when it comes to Navy. So sorry, but that's about the limits of what I can do. Steve Gray, thank you very much for those comments. World War One aviation is another one of my favourite topics. I wondered if you'd be able to do a thumbnail bio about Rutland of Jutland. Okay, yeah, I probably should. Yes. So basically, can I do a short bio about Rutland of Jutland? Yes. It's probably not something really for a Drydock, because if I'm going to cover that, it'll probably be in a Wednesday video, maybe looking at short bios of a number of different people who were influential to early carrier aviation, followed up by another video where I will probably be very, very, very uncomplimentary about the early 1920s US bombing test against Ostfriesland and the way they're misrepresented in a lot of popular media. So I need to keep that for later reference. Blood Axe, could you go over the primary gun turret layouts for capital ships and their arcs of fire? How long have you got? I mean, if you want to go very, very broadly, in the early part of, let's say, Dreadnought development, because if we go back to Ironclads, we're going to be here all night. So Dreadnought development, you have the start of what will be the actual kind of the general go-to layout much later on, which is something like South Carolina's all-in-line super firing gun positions, which obviously have approximately clear 270-degree fire arcs, although exactly what those arcs are will depend both on the gun turret itself and also whether it's the super firing or non-super firing one. So, when I say broadly 270, you get the idea of, they can fire ahead or astern, they can fire broadside, and they have a degree of traverse inwards. But whilst that will become that kind of fore-aft layout in some way, shape, or form, with its 4 twins, 4 triples, 3 triples, whatever, will later become standard. In the interim, you have wing turret positions, with like Dreadnought, Helgoland, Nassau, etc. On those, the fore and aft fire arcs are pretty much similar, but the wing turrets ostensibly will have roughly 180-degree arcs of fire. On ships with multiple wing turrets like the Nassaus and Helgolands, not so much, because obviously you'd be firing straight back into or forward into another wing turret. But in more practical terms, their arcs of fire are generally much more restricted, not quite 90-degree, but maybe 100, 120-degree or so, because if you've got a wing turret that theoretically can fire dead ahead, but if it does, you're going to do a reasonable amount of damage to your own superstructure and deck. So you can do it, but practically speaking, not so much. Then you've got ships like Rivadavia, Minas Gerais, Invincible, Von-der-Tann, Espana, etc., with en-echelon turrets amidships. Now, the en-echelon turrets tend to have slightly greater arcs of fire broadside compared to your average wing turret, usually because there's only one of them and the decks are a little bit clearer and they're more amidships for the most part. And they have a degree of crossfire capability, which again varies on the ships. For example, Rivadavia or the Indefatigables have more crossfire capability than the Invincibles or the Minas Gerais due to size and layout. But practically speaking, almost any ship with en-echelon turrets tended to have a far, far less arc of fire on the opposite side for the en-echelon turret than they do on paper. Again, due to issues with blast effects. In some cases, it's so bad you almost have to be perfectly perpendicular, not quite, but almost, to get a full broadside. Then you have ships with an amidships turret or more, so Texas, Iron Duke, Koenigs, if I get that one right, I think, yes, the Koenigs, Fusoni to a degree, that kind of thing. So where you have a turret that cannot fire forward or aft, but has reasonable arcs of fire on either broadside. And then when you go further forward, obviously you have the all-forward turret layout where you have fairly big arcs of fire forward and on the broadsides, and usually a reasonable degree aft, but you don't have any aft fire capability. And then you have refinements on all of the above, plus the traditional fore and aft layout we mentioned at the beginning. And when I talk about refinements, I mean things like, Littorio. One of the reasons the Littorio's aft turret is basically in a super firing position without having a turret to super fire over, is to allow it to have better forward arcs of fire. Because it's mounted higher, it can therefore fire closer along the beam. So that's a brief potted history of some of the main gun turret layouts they use for capital ships. Bright D Sublet asks, using the Battle of the Denmark Strait as a template for 2v2 engagements, i.e. the same time of day, course, sea state, ship speed, visibility, etc., what group of two sets of historical ship classes built to counter each other might be your favourite to pitch a hypothetical battle or possibly an episode for an alternate history battle, i.e. Panzerschiff versus Dunkirks versus Scharnhorsts, German twins, the Scharnhorst versus Allied heavy units built to counter them, etc. Okay, so pairs of ships built to counter each other, chucked into a Denmark Strait scenario. What would be my favourite one to examine? I would probably say the one that jumps out immediately would be the Dunkirks versus the Scharnhorsts. Because I would give Strasbourg, as I've said, I think before, I'd give Strasbourg better than even odds of winning her fight, but I'd give the Scharnhorst organizer, now whichever one's fighting her, slightly better than even odds of winning their fight against Dunkirk. At which point it would be a question of who wins their fight the fastest gets to gang up on the remaining ships. So the Dunkirks versus Scharnhorst would definitely be an interesting alternate Battle of Denmark Strait style scenario. I mean, ships built to counter pairs of ships built to counter each other. I suppose the other ones that would also be interesting, although perhaps for me personally not as interesting as that setup, would be maybe the North Carolinas versus the Bismarcks. So North Carolina and Washington versus Bismarck and Tirpitz. There's nothing. I mean, there's Renown and Repulse, but what was built in pairs in a pair that you could put them up against that would be close to an even fight? I mean, I suppose you could put Renown and Repulse against Scharnhorst and Eisenhower, but we already know from Lofoten that the Germans thought that would have been a disadvantageous fight to be in, so it's not as interesting. Maybe Renown and Repulse versus a random picked pair of Congos or something like that. Ross M. Hood versus Mackinson. Well, yeah, if they'd actually built... Well, if they completed any Mackinsons and had built more than one Hood. Yeah, so I think those would probably be my top picks. I mean, the two Yamatos versus two Iowas is also an obvious one, although they're not strictly built to counter each other. Pair of Yamatos versus a pair of Montanas, if they'd built them, would be quite interesting. And, yes, of course, GHK 364 pointing out Richelieu's versus the Littorios. That would also be quite interesting to watch. Okay, so I think, yes, that in fact does wrap up the Patreon questions at 2 hours and 26 minutes. So I can see that very, very helpfully the Legacy has charted all of the super chats, hopefully. That's certainly a few of them. Okay, let's go catch up on those. Cool. Right. Okay. Let's go through those quickly then. Michael McLeod. On Schweiger versus Lusitania, do you think he weighed up the ramifications, or was it compulsive like a big game hunter bagging a trophy? Also, does the idea he was only intending to cripple her have merit? I don't know. If you're a submarine commander and you're sending torpedoes the way of a ship, you're not aiming to cripple that ship. You have no idea how many torpedoes are going to land. You don't know where they're going to land. And torpedoes are designed to sink ships. If you're a submarine commander and you fire a spread of torpedoes at a target and you later claim you were trying to cripple them, the only person you're kidding is yourself. You're aiming to kill. It's just, that is just how it is. As far as, do you think he weighed up the ramifications? Not really, because I don't think so. Because if you think about what position he's in, he doesn't know exactly who is on board Lusitania. And to be perfectly honest, he's been out on patrol. He probably also isn't 100%... Well, he's also only subject to what the German Navy has told him the political situation is. So I don't think in any way, shape or form he was sitting there looking through the periscope going, yes, well, if I fire these torpedoes at Lusitania, there's a possibility I might bring America into the war because there's a bunch of American civilians on the ship and they don't like, they don't like being sunk and the government doesn't like them being sunk. I don't think any of that went through his head. I think it was purely a case of there's a target. It's a big, obvious target. It's a British flagship. I'm here to sink British flagships. I will fire torpedoes at it, and hopefully it will sink. Most things after that, I think, are probably either other people's ad hoc post-justifications or attempted justifications. I mean, and let's face it, yes, it was a horrible tragedy, but those things happen in war. You can't I don't think you can be particularly harsh on Schwieger himself for doing the job that he'd been told to do, any more than you can be harsh on any other U-boat commander. Because let's face it, pretty much any other U-boat commander in the Kaiserliche Marine would have done exactly the same thing. It just happened to be him who was there. Alright, top up the iron brew. Sugar. Redneck Fury. If the Royal Navy was so willing to use US Navy kit like gun directors, why did they not look into US Navy high pressure plants? The horsepower to weight advantages would have made Royal Navy ships faster or smaller. Partly its scale, partly its availability. So gun directors like the Mark 37 have a relatively clear advantage over a number of Royal Navy systems, and even if the Royal Navy has confidence in things like HAX 4, they physically can't build enough of them. So at that point you might as well grab as many that Mark 37s or whatever that the US Navy is willing to offer you, because your alternative is not having gun directors. Whereas when it comes to things like boilers and other, well, high pressure boiler systems, for the most part, it's not the production of boilers that's slowing things down for Royal Navy building efforts. And they have their reasons for choosing the lower pressure plants, and it's also in terms of commonality of spares. If everything's using, well, obviously not everything will be going to be using it, but if ships are out there broadly with something, let's say a Yarrow boiler set, then engineers can be swapped across ships as needed. Spare parts can be stocked everywhere as needed. Whereas if you end up with a sort of a two-tier system in the Royal Navy's engineering crews, where some crews are trained on how to operate high-pressure plants that are bought from the US, and others are trained on operating the Royal Navy's lower-pressure plants, it introduces bottlenecks in your manpower. It means you have to carry two sets of spares almost everywhere. Logistically, it's just not worth it. Theoretically, yes, not even in hindsight, but on a intellectual level, you might think, yes, this ship would have been better if it had a USN style high pressure plant. But in terms of the grand strategy of fighting a war, a small number of your capital ships with a completely different engineering system to what everything else in your fleet has is usually a relatively bad idea. Patrick Forney, did you read the book The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors? Yes, I did. In fact, I have 2 copies of it. I have a paperback copy, and I have a digital Kindle copy for easier reference. Shona23666, thank you very much for the donation and the kind message. Dreadnought, I don't know too much about German battleships, so forgive my ignorance, but I've read people claiming Bismarck could take on Iowa. I disagree, but what's your analysis of a likely match? In theory, yes, it is possible that Bismarck could beat Iowa. It's not likely. I mean, apart from anything, the two ships literally exist in 2 different time frames. Iowa isn't in service before Bismarck is sunk. So there's a whole technological issue going on there. You know, if you magically transport Bismarck from, I don't know, 5 minutes before the Battle of Denmark Strait and transport her forward in time to when Iowa's actually around to shoot at, Iowa's going to have superior technology, apart from anything else. But, Bismarck is, as I've said before, Bismarck is still a very dangerous battleship. She's inefficient. She's a low 40,000 ton displacement battleship that can, broadly speaking, be described as being able to go toe to toe with 35,000 tonners. You know, she can. she stands, if not necessarily an even odds chance, but within the 40 to 60% bracket, depending on the exact ship and the exact engagement profile. But she stands a reasonable fighting chance against 35,000-ton treaty-era battleships. But that's not a great advertisement for the efficiency of something that weighs, as much as a small cruiser's worth of displacement more than those battleships. The flip side is that the Iowa is a ostensibly 45,000-ton, actually a bit heavier escalator clause battleship. It outmasses Bismarck anyway. It's faster than Bismarck. It's got more guns than Bismarck. It's got heavier guns than Bismarck. About the only thing that you can point at Iowa at is that in theory its armour plate is physically thinner than Bismarck's, albeit that it is sloped and angled. The armour layouts are very, very different on those two ships. And that's before you get into fire control systems, radar, etc., etc. But even if you just look at the very basic speed protection firepower triangle and ignore all the other details, the Iowa is a superior ship just even on that basic paper analysis. Let alone the fact, as I say, that Iowa is actually, it's not the most efficient ship design, because it is, in contrast to most US Navy designs for battleships, it is a far more weighted towards speed than on average, but it's still a much more efficient design than Bismarck. So, yeah, if you were going to say Bismarck versus Iowa fights, who wins? Very crudely, Iowa wins. Could Bismarck beat an Iowa in a fight? There are scenarios where this might happen, but it's much less likely than Iowa beating Bismarck. The same way that any two broadly comparable military units taking each other on, you're occasionally going to get underdog victories. Bob Fryer says, thank you from the USS Salem fan club. Yeah, well, thank you. Well, USS Salem, as per the recent update to the Drydock website, is going to be the first ship I'm going to be seeing in the US. So if you're interested, by the way, if you head over to drydock.co.uk, there's now a little tab at the top, US trip, which has the dates and locations of where I'm going to be on my US trip. Where it's marked private or rest, don't worry, that doesn't, well, I say don't worry. If it says private-rest, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm just taking the entire day off. There are other things that I'm going... Walter Broad US pointing out, yes, Sydney lost to Cornwall when ostensibly Sydney is on paper a far superior vessel. But going back to the US trip, there are some other places I'm going to be visiting, and a few collaborations I'm hopefully going to be doing while I'm in the States. But obviously those are private, so they're just marked private. Whereas if you see a location and a date on that list, then that is a location and a date that I am happy to meet people at. And more details of exactly how to do that will be coming later on. He also says, remember USS Bear. I shall attempt to. Desert Foxo says, just coming over from Dr. Clark's, how do you think the UK keeping Heligoland when Queen Victoria came to power would affect World War I and World War II? World War I, it's going to be a complete pain for the High Seas Fleet. The British would have had to fortify the heck out of it. I don't think the Germans would go after it in terms of trying to invade it in World War One. Hopefully it would have been turned into a fairly tough nut to crack, and it would be a massive, obvious invitation for the Grand Fleet, because it would commit the Germans to having significant resources effectively pinned in place, trying to deal with the defences of Heligoland which would allow the ground fleet to come in and engage at will, which is exactly what the Germans don't want. And of course, it gives an excellent place for the British to stage reconnaissance, etc. from. World War II, on the other hand, is a completely different matter. By that point, it probably would be even more heavily fortified, but I can't see it standing up for too long. In World War II, I think maybe mid 1940 or so, the Germans probably would take it. Whether that would be with Fallschirmjäger or some form of amphibious assault, I don't know. But I think the Germans would have a pretty good crack at it, and they'd probably occupy it in 40 or 41. But it would be it would be a very big annoyance to them until it fell. Joseph Nielsen asks, where's that gone? My neighbour's father commanded Dutch subs in the East Indies in the 1930s. Okay, that's impressive. T-14 and T-16, I think. He was recalled before Japan invaded and spent the war interned by Germany. What happened to the Dutch subs? In the East Indies, the Dutch subs went on a tear. You had Admiral Helfrich was known as Ship a Day Helfrich because the Dutch subs really took a shine to knocking down Japanese ships in the early part of the war. They did suffer some fairly steep casualties, especially because of the low numbers that they had and the fact that you weren't going to get replacements. A single Dutch sub that gets sunk is a much more significant impact on the remaining Dutch sub fleet as it compared to a British or American sub getting sunk in the Far East. But the Dutch subs were pretty darn effective in the early part of the war, and then subsequently they didn't lose that much of their effectiveness, but they did start to be redeployed, and B, some of their achievements started to be overshadowed by the larger other allied subfleets, especially once various issues, whether that be the US fixing the Mark 14 or the British actually deploying a few more subs back out there, start to come in. I know it's a fairly long shot, but if your neighbour's father's still around and maybe would like an interview, I'd be more than happy to talk to him. And if a translator is needed, I'd also be happy to arrange that. If he's not, which, to be fair, that is an increasing issue when it comes to World War II veterans. But if there's more details on what he did that perhaps your neighbour's willing to provide, I'd also be very glad to have a look at those. Jacob Moss, what if von der Tann was beached instead of scuttled, was bought by Sweden? Could they refit her with Bofors 11-inch? And how useful is she? What rebuild refit would she get in the 30s? I did actually answer this question yesterday. I was going to say last stream, it literally was yesterday. If Sweden gets their hand on von der Tann, then yes, I don't see any problem with refitting her with Bofors 11-inch at all. How useful is she? Well, again, as I said before, yesterday, she would be quite a deterrent to the Russians, because even a Bofors, to be fair, a Bofors 11-inch armed von der Tann is still on paper inferior to a Gangut or a Gangut refit, but the Swedes would have, competent crews and a decent maintenance schedule, which are two things that are not particularly known in the interwar period Soviet Navy. It doesn't really help that Stalin in the late 30s was executing anyone who showed signs of intelligence. In terms of a refit rebuild, I don't know if she'd get much, or if any, because the Swedes aren't exactly flush with too much cash, and if they're maintaining her in addition to the Sverigers, that's going to be a bit of a strain on the naval budget. But if they are going to give her anything, it would be 40mm Bofors AA guns and improved fire control systems. Replacing the machinery is probably not so much of a priority for what's effectively a glorified coastal defence ship at that point. And it would ramp up the Kriegsmarine's assessment of we really can't go after Sweden in the middle of World War II. Squirrel Jenkins, if you swap the carriers and battleships in the Pearl Harbor attack, how does the early war play out? So basically the carriers are in, the battleships are out, the carriers get sunk. The early war plays out pretty badly for the US because having the old slow battleships, they can't really do all that much. I mean, sure, the fleet oilers could keep 3 or 4 of them out at a time, but they're slow. They're not going to catch anything the Japanese don't want them to catch. They don't have the air defense necessary to stop the coup de bataille just picking them off one at a time. And, well, you've got Hornet in the process of commissioning, because you'd have what? You'd have Enterprise, Lexington, and Yorktown gone. Enterprise, Saratoga, and Lexington gone. Help for flip's sake. I am tired. Enterprise, Yorktown, and Saratoga. Lexington's elsewhere. You'd have Lexington, Wasp. Even then, they probably wouldn't send Ranger in. But you'd have, once Hornet commissions, you'd have Lexington, Wasp, and Hornet to do everything with. You could probably redeploy them quickly enough that you'd maybe still have Coral Sea, but you wouldn't have the initial raids. You wouldn't have the initial raids that they did going on. So Coral Sea would probably be the first big deployment, which would be, at that point, probably maybe Lexington and Wasp instead of Lexington and Yorktown. Then you lose Lexington, so you're down to Wasp and Yorktown, with Yorktown damaged. What am I saying? I'm really messing up. Sorry. Hornet and Wasp. I need more iron brew. And Wasp may not survive the damage that Yorktown was crippled by, because obviously she's much lighter built, but assuming that she somehow does, a damaged Wasp and a fresh Hornet, if she gets rushed, the US isn't going to fight Midway with those two. And yeah, they might bring in Ranger as a backstop, but they're not going to commit to Midway with a beaten up Wasp, Ranger, and Hornet at that point. So the US would be on the back foot for a lot longer. Basically, I mean, they would have to still commit to Guadalcanal, because Henderson Field has a huge strategic implication for the entire Southwest Pacific region. But with that very limited group of carriers, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, if they lose Hornet this time, and they're left with Wasp, assuming Wasp has even survived at this point, she very well might not have. The US could legitimately, by the end of 1942, have run out of carriers completely, apart from maybe Ranger, which would, they might be holding on to Guadalcanal by the skin of their teeth if they've managed to exact a fair price out of the Japanese. But when Essex and her sisters start to come online in early 43, they're going to instead of supplementing a handful of survivors, i.e. Enterprise and Saratoga, they're going to have to be replacing the US carrier fleet in the Pacific. So the US counter attacks subsequent to the Guadalcanal campaign probably going to be delayed by about, I'd say, 4 to 6 months, maybe slightly more, in exchange for what? You have a slightly stronger shore bombardment group. Flubber 11 USA, can you talk about USS Sable and Wolverine, the machine gun carriers? Yeah, I do need to do a 5-minute guide on them at some point soon. I've managed to finally, actually, that's a good point. That's plugged in. I think, don't quote me on this just yet. I'm just waiting for File Explorer to boot up. I think Mrs. Drack has gotten around to upload. Did you scan any pictures of some very interesting looking? Yes, you did. Sorry, don't worry. Right, now let me see if I can get this to work. No. add source, media file. Yes. Okay, that's not how I was envisaging that going. But nevertheless. Hopefully my face has now been replaced by USS Wolverine, which is not a phrase I saw myself saying when I started this stream. But yes, Mrs. Drac has successfully scanned some of the pictures of Sable and Wolverine that I've managed to acquire. So let's move that away now. There we go. So now that those are scanned in, at some point later in the year, you will almost certainly see the 5-minute guide to Sable and Wolverine. So the training carriers, the paddle wheel powered training carriers of the US Navy, and the valuable service that they gave. Ace Moonshot, thank you very much. Packer 910. December 11th, 1941, Hitler delivers a speech, but instead of declaring war on the US, he denounces Japan's sneak attack. Can FDR still get the US involved in Europe, and if not, how does it affect the Pacific during 42? If he can't, then obviously the US can commit more resources to the Pacific during 42, albeit maybe not quite as many as you might otherwise think, because you still have a fleet oiler shortage. But you've got more reserves to draw on. So when you get to something like, say, Guadalcanal, some of the shortages of cruisers and destroyers and such that they had, they'd have more to feed into that particular little engagement. But can FDR still get the US involved in Europe? Yes, probably, because remember that German ships were attacking US ships like USS Reuben James in the Atlantic already. So given that Japan is an ally of Germany, even if Hitler denounces the sneak attack, FDR might be able to turn around and say, well, you know, repudiate your alliance with Japan, and Japan, well, he's not going to tell Japan what to do, because obviously they've just declared war on him, but he might be able to demand that Germany and Italy renounce their connections with Japan, or else he will consider them co-belligerents because they're allies of Japan and Japan has just attacked them. And it's relatively unlikely that Japan and Italy would throw Japan under the bus completely. I mean, if they do, then it's a big coup because you've separated everything out, and the yeah, that'd be an interesting one if he could somehow force. I mean, if he somehow forces Hitler and Mussolini's hands into denouncing Japan completely and utterly, that would be somewhat handy, because that cuts all coordination, such as it was. But I don't think it would happen, and he'd be able to say, well, you know what, they're fine words, but they're not they're not dropping their allies, so we're at war with them as well. Altira Mungara, given the problems with British AP rounds at the Battle of Jutland, would they have been better off firing high explosive? And what would the effects of high explosive have been? For some of the shots, yes, but not for all of them. Because you've got to remember with Jutland, yes, the British AP rounds did have problems, but they didn't not work all the time. You know, the working over that Seydlitz got, and the fact that Lutzow sank, a number of those holes that were poked in both ships and various other German ships were from AP rounds that functioned properly. And other hits, you know, hits on belt armour, etc., where the AP rounds didn't work completely perfectly, HE rounds bursting on those points would have done even less, because an HE round bursting on the outside of your belt armor is not really going to trouble you all that much. Of course, the flip side is that perhaps HE rounds hitting the superstructure or the unarmored, lightly armored ends of the German ships, etc., those might well have done more damage, maybe set large fires or something like that. But you'd basically have to go through the whole thing play by play, hit by hit, and work out, did this hit, did the AP shell work or not? If it didn't, would an HE shell have done better or not? And I think broadly, continuing to fire AP was probably just about slightly better than firing off HE all the time. What would have been a really nice compromise, if they'd known that was going to happen, would be maybe for all the ships that could to fire CPC, which was kind of a semi-armor piercing round that had a fair degree of armor piercing capability, not as much as an AP shell, but a much, much bigger HE, almost HE style explosive payload. So if you're going to ask if they fire CPC, and would that be better off than fire AP, then I would agree, because the CPC shot would have done as well, if not better, than the AP rounds with every hit, except maybe for a handful of hits on the main armor belt, where it wouldn't have had quite the penetration available. But everywhere else, it would have done more damage than the AP rounds. Alan M. If the Nelson class had left out the conning tower from the design, could the saved weight have been enough to keep the main turret strong enough to not have their early career problems? Maybe. It's a few hundred tons weight. I mean, adding once you've taken account other things, but I mean, you're talking about maybe adding 50 to 100 tons per turret in terms of structural weight to the roller paths, the turret structure, etc. I wouldn't say it would completely obviate their early career problems, but it would probably address the majority of the issues with the turrets themselves. I mean, you're still going to have issues with firing over the deck and blast effects, but yeah, I'd say as a rule of thumb, if they dropped the conning tower entirely, or maybe just put a splinter-proof one on, then you might have had enough weight there to basically almost retain the original G3 turret design. Todd Webb asks, Battle of Lofoten, but it's repulse instead of renown. World War I fire control and no radar. The Germans are probably still going to retreat because they don't necessarily know that. But I mean, and the weather was pretty awful anyway, so the chances of anyone scoring hits on anything is somewhat remote. It was very lucky that any hits were landed in that battle on either side. But yeah, on paper, repulse would be at at a disadvantage. But given the circumstances, I think the Scharnhorst wouldn't risk it. They'd still just make a beeline for an escape. But repulse is less likely to score hits, and that might persuade the Scharnhorst to maybe give it a go. It's marginal, but yeah, it's one of these things where on paper, yes, there's quite a significant change, but given the practicalities of the situation, there might not actually be all that much of a difference. Sorry, I'm just trying to see round the ring light so I can see what I'm doing. Pendon Harley, you may advance the completion date by 1 year for one major warship for each navy in World War II. Which ships do you choose to help the Allies? Okay, one major warship for each navy in World War II for the Allies. Okay, I'd advance the completion date of one of the Sovietsky Soyuzes by 1 year, just because it would be hilarious to watch the fighting over it. Be a good diversion as well. For the French, I'd advance Richelieu by a year easily, because that means there's a completed Richelieu out there, and Richelieu historically had a captain who the Vichy French government thought there was a very good chance that he might defect to the Free French, and they ended up replacing him while Richelieu was holed up in the French-controlled parts of Africa, precisely because of that, whilst Richelieu was trying to sort out the fact that she was half complete. So if there's a fully complete Richelieu with her captain, except now he has probably had a bunch of sailing experience with the British before the French surrender, I would probably put the odds at greater than 50% that he would actually defect and take Richelieu with him, which would be great, because then Richelieu gets to fight the Bismarck. It's one of my ambitions for any kind of alternate scenarios, to get Richelieu fighting Bismarck. As far as the British are concerned, advancing Vanguard by a year doesn't do much, because it might get her into service by just about for the end of World War II, but it's not going to help massively. I would probably say, for the British, if you're going to advance the completion date of any one major warship by a year, actually, well, it would be either Lion, because if you can do that and say, right, well, actually, so you're going to be somehow advancing and solving the problems of completing the 16-inch guns as well, then you're saying, well, Lion therefore will be ready in some point in mid-42. Then they'll probably choose to continue pressing on with Lion, because Anson and Howe, you're looking at similar kinds of scenarios, which then means that Lion would be available for something like Battle of the North Cape, keeping an eye on Tirpitz, being probably the Royal Navy flagship in the Eastern Fleet, etc. Albeit that perhaps more prosaically, given what the Royal Navy was facing at the time, if you're maybe, instead of advancing a battleship, it might be better to maybe advance something like Indefatigable, get another big armoured carrier in service earlier, which is probably the more practical one, even if it would be really nice to have Lion. And for the US, it's fairly simple. I'd get Essex in the water a year early, because Essex is ready early mid-43. If Essex is ready early mid-42, then, it's not going to get Coral Sea. You might scrape Essex coming in for Midway, and you definitely have Essex around for Guadalcanal. So that would be quite useful. Ace Moonshot saying hit the like. Brian Nicholas says, in Maine you've got bombed with snow. Thank you very much, Brian Nicholas, and I hope the snow isn't too bad for you. Whilst we don't have feet of snow outside, we are currently without any form of gas central heating, because our boiler's packed up. It seems to have packed up while I was away filming in Portsmouth. Although it's not the boiler, it's actually the valve that controls the hot water flow between the central heating and the hot water supply for showers and kitchen stuff, etc. But basically, the long and the short of it is we don't have any central heating from the gas boiler. Gas boiler tech is coming in on Tuesday, and it's very cold outside. The only lucky thing is that I have a few electric heaters, and we recently had solar panels put in, so I can use the electric heaters to keep us warm during the day. Knight 6831, doesn't Essex entering in 42 save Yorktown from her demise as she could be pulled in for repairs? Maybe, but to be honest, the US wasn't... I mean, the reason they put Yorktown in on the front lines for Midway was because they really didn't want to go up. They didn't want to fight Midway with a disadvantage in carrier numbers. So if they've got Essex available, they'll probably still send Yorktown out, because then they can go even for things. Yeah, Boiler Tech's coming on Tuesday to help sort out what's going on with the boiler, hopefully. Hopefully it'll just be a bit of WD-40 to the valve, but part of being an engineer is knowing when you don't have the expertise, and there's no way I'm going with a pair of pliers and messing around with a high-pressure gas and hot water system. Freedom Autopsy Report asks, how many ships lie at the bottom of the ocean because of World War One and World War Two? Thousands. Exactly how many, I have no idea. You'd have to add up all combat losses in terms of warships, plus all merchant losses, plus all incidental losses, because ships were still lost in storms and going aground and such like. But yeah, thousands of ships went down over the course of both of those wars. Fog Battleship Warspite, if the line class, if they were built, do you see them acting like Iowa did in the US Navy, being used throughout the 20th century, reactivated in the different conflicts the Royal Navy was involved in, and also thoughts of turning into a museum ship? I don't think, unfortunately, that would be the case. You might see a Lion class for the Korean War. And if they've got, let's say if they complete Lion and Temeraire, so they've got Lion, Temeraire and Vanguard. Vanguard's off doing Royal Yacht duties. The Royal Navy's still really, really pressed for cash. So as I say, you might see a Lion class reactivated for the Korean War, but realistically, I mean, if they've got 3 modern ships, I mean, they kept the King George V in reserve for a while, then scrapped them because they changed the force commitment that the Royal Navy was supposed to put in for NATO. There's an outside chance that with 3 modern battleships, they might get rid of... Well, I can see potentially the Royal Navy trying to make a cost argument of they still get rid of Vanguard in the mid to late 50s, and then they might argue, kind of like they did with Ark Royal and Eagle in the 70s, they might say, well, we want to keep a battleship in reserve just in case, and we can make it cheaper because we can rob spares from the other one to keep the first one operational, which will be less expensive. Given how badly the Royal Navy was cut to the bone by various 1960s and 1970s UK government positions, I can't see the ship staying in active service all that much, unless maybe the Royal Navy decides to throw the Tigers on the scrap pile and stick a horrible box hanger on the back instead of the aft turret or something like that. But there's an outside possibility, maybe a 10-20% chance possibility that it might, therefore you might have a Lion in some way, shape or form still hanging around, probably in the reserve fleet by the early 70s, at which point it's probably just about old enough they might therefore turn it into a museum ship, perhaps instead of Belfast or something like that, which would be really funny if you had a Lion class battleship sitting in the Thames. So, Pega Mixel asks, was the idea behind the US Chippewa-class first rates merely a political decision or rather a kind of political statement. One could say Pennsylvania was of little use even when not being in flames. The Chippewa-class ships of the line. Let's see if I've read that question correctly. Okay, right. Okay, so it's a first rate. Just take a quick look. I mean, it's slightly overgunned apart from anything else, but never mind. I don't think it's so much a political thing. I mean, yes, in hindsight, Pennsylvania didn't do a tremendous amount, but you've got to look at the reasons why the US was ordering first rates in the aftermath of the War of 1812, and third rates for that matter, which was basically, whilst the Royal Navy had been somewhat distracted in the early part with the rest of the Napoleonic Wars, and the US had been able to utilise its heavy frigates to great advantage, as I'm sure you all know, by the end of the War of 1812, with a temporary peace coming to Europe and more Royal Navy ships showing off the US coast, there was the US Navy, including the heavy frigates, were basically locked down for the most part. And when they tried to break out, it usually didn't go very well, like USS President. And that was in large part because of the presence of big, heavy Rasay frigates and third-rate ships of the line. The Royal Navy still didn't send any first rates, but apart from St. Lawrence, obviously up in on the lakes. So the idea that the US had was basically to step things up. Instead of having a few heavily armed frigates that could cause a great deal of distress for the enemy's heavily armed or more regularly armed frigates, the idea was if they could then have a small core of ships of the line, again individually more heavily armed than average, that could have a similar effect on the kind of blockade the British threw up in 1814. If you're not going to stand a chance if they turn up with a Trafalgar-scale fleet, but they would have to turn up with a Trafalgar-scale fleet to stop you, and it's almost not quite the same as the German risk fleet strategy, i.e. Britain has a lot of other concerns. They might choose, therefore, to not mess with you rather than commit resources they'd really rather use elsewhere. So there was a practical benefit to the idea of building first rates, because it would force the Royal Navy to either accept that the US Navy could do to a certain degree what it wanted, or they'd have to commit a number of their own valuable first rates to the area to keep things under control, which makes it more of a strategic decision than a political one. But yes, in the long term, given that in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, the British really didn't have any major wars for a very long time thereafter, and the Americans weren't particularly interested in going to war with the British again, then it would eventually turn out that the first rates and other ships of the line the Americans had built were just a bit too expensive to run, especially considering, as usual, Congress immediately took all their money away. Ramal asks, during Halsey's Typhoon or Typhoon Cobra, what if the ships were prepared or rigged for storm? Is it possible that all of them would have survived the weather? No. In theory it's possible, but one of the biggest problems for some of the ships that went down, apart from the fact they're just small and the seas were very big, was that a number of them were riding quite light because they didn't have... They were running low on fuel and heading for refueling. I suppose in theory, I mean, some ships did artificially bunkered themselves down by filling their bunkers with seawater. So I guess maybe given enough warning, if some of the ships had been prepared to, you know, fill up a good chunk of their bunkerage with seawater to let themselves become more stable, then possibly. But for some of those ships, they were really running low on fuel, so whether they would have had enough fuel, unpolluted fuel, to be able to continue to operate through the storm would be another fairly serious question. So, yeah, maybe, but probably not. There would still probably be at least one or two that would go down. Frank Spazzato: could Drac cover the Type 39 Elbing class torpedo boats? What is the creepy pic behind him? Yeah, at some point I'll do a 5-minute guide for the Type 39s. As far as the picture, which picture? If you mean this one, that's me at a steampunk event. There's another one of me, a similar one of me. It's actually just behind my head. It's just a closer up one. Hang on, yeah, so you could see that there. Whoop, there we go. Thank you very much, Dreadnought. And I think we've caught up with the Super Chat questions then. So for as long as the Iron Brew and my voice lasts, I can start taking questions in the chat, which means I just need to readjust this slightly. And now I can actually see the chat itself because it's not behind the ring light anymore. BK Zhong: every 26 to 28 knot big gun capital ship versus every 29 and above big gun capital ship, which side wins? Let's see. So that's on the 29 plus side. So we will have Hood, Renown, Repulse, Richelieu. Do we count Jean Bart? Maybe. Let's count Jean Bart as well. Scharnhorsts, Bismarcks, Littorios, Congos. That's for the Japanese. That's the Russians didn't have any Littorios. That's them. Vanguard. The Iowas, obviously. And then what have we got to stack up against that? Yamatos, South Dakotas, North Carolinas, King George V's, the Italian refits, and then basically the Nelsons, all the French dreadnoughts, the Corbets and Britannias, the entire standard battle line, the Grand Fleet, and all those battle cruisers, the QEs, the Rs, we said the Nelsons already, the Ganguts, the High Seas Fleet, Fusos, Iseis, Nagatos. Oh no, 26 to 28 knots, so eliminate a bunch of those. Okay. Okay, 26 to 28 knot. That makes it a bit harder. So at that point, let's see, we've got North Carolina, South Dakotas, King George V's, 26 knots, that's the Nagatos, the Italian refits, and that's about it. Have I missed anyone? Fusos are slower, Iseis are slower, Ganguts are slower, QEs and Rs are slower, Nelson's slower, Corbets Britannias are slower, Standards are slower. I think at that point The 29 plus knotters are probably going to take it. Actually, just about. Yeah. Jake Miller, at which point in history do you think there were the largest number of active warships? Probably the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, the Royal Navy alone had something along the lines of 800 rated ships at one point during the Napoleonic Wars, and that's not including, you know, the unrated ships like brigs and cutters and stuff like that. As far as, if I remember the the listing that I read correctly, and so that's just the Royal Navy. That's not counting the French Navy, the Spanish Navy, the US Navy, the Russian Navy, and everybody else's navies. So yeah, the Napoleonic Wars, at least in terms of, you know, more recent navies, if you go back to sort of ancient times, I'm fairly sure there were even more triremes around at some point. But in terms of gun-armed warships, at least, I would say probably the Napoleonic Wars. Knight 6831, could the 1944 lines have been given more powerful engines to get above 30 knots? I think they were supposed to anyway. They might have stuck at 28 knots. I mean, in theory, yeah, if you want to up-engine the Lions, you could give them the latest and greatest US power plants. But by 44, whether or not a battleship is doing 28 or 30 knots is probably largely immaterial compared to some other things. Right. Would the Deutschland class count for the 26 to 29 knot gang? I don't think it would make a lot of difference. Publius Servilius Vatia Iscarius asks, 1718 Battle of Cape Passaro video? At some point. Sure. There's a lot of battles to cover. Obligatory Drydock question, when will we see a model of HMS Drakenfell made available? Well, someone did send me a rather nice 3D render of it, although it was kind of a mashup of bits and pieces from World of Warships. So it's a nice 3D model, but there would need to be a lot of finessing and work to make it into a printable STL, and then I'd have to print the STL. Jacob Palmer, Alaska and Scharnhorst meet in open water alone. Scharnhorst has twin 15-inch guns. Which is the more probable to walk away? At that point, assuming they're both using 1945 fire control systems of their respective nations, probably the Scharnhorst. It's got more displacement. It's got... And I mean, this is the thing that always comes down to with Alaska versus Scharnhorst questions. Scharnhorst does have significantly more armour than the Alaskas. And if it's carrying 15-inch guns, then there's quite a wide range, especially in 1945, where Scharnhorst could engage Alaska, and Alaska is completely vulnerable to incoming fire, and Scharnhorst has at least some protection against Alaska's fire. BR Class 47 asks, how would World War II change if the ship girls from Asia Lane were involved? I'd have to play the game to understand what on earth that would even mean. And also, why didn't the Royal Navy think about getting US-type guns for the Vanguards or Lions? One, they didn't want to be reliant on anyone else, and two, they were perfectly capable of manufacturing their own guns, or at least they were right up until major development issues occurred with the Lion's 16-inch guns, but that's not something they could have foreseen at the time they started developing it. Plus, also, the US was, building quite a few of its own battleships, so whether or not the US would have responded favourably to the British rolling up and asking if they could have, several dozen of their 16-inch guns is also a completely different matter. Ramal asks, why did the USN late war battleships have armoured conning towers and the Royal Navy battleships didn't? Did that really help during engagements? I've mentioned this before. It's basically a two-part thing. One, it's cultural. The Royal Navy captains just basically didn't use them. So regardless of the various merits or demerits of a conning tower, it was pretty pointless to have one if people just seemed to categorically refuse to use them in the first place. As far as the more practical sides of things, again, I've said before, my personal view is that, certainly by World War One and World War Two, a conning tower that's armoured against cruiser-grade gunfire or against shrapnel is probably worth having around as a backup, but I don't think they're really worth all that much in capital ship engagements. If they get hit directly, for various reasons, it doesn't really seem to matter how thickly armoured they are. Everyone inside ends up dead or wounded anyway. So there's no point in wasting the weight on them, especially considering the various downsides in terms of lack of visibility and command and control, etc. And if the shell's going to land somewhere else in the superstructure, well, that's blast and shrapnel, so you can guard against that with much less armour. So why bother? But that's my assessment. The US Navy obviously disagreed. The Royal Navy kind of more agreed with me than otherwise. But yeah, arguments about whether or not having a conning tower is worth it in the abstract can go on forever and a day between a lot of different naval historians. But with the Royal Navy, I say a good chunk of it was just the fact that regardless of what may or may not have been considered a valid argument, the Royal Navy captains just flat out refused to use them anyway. Nanami Kamiya, alternate history. Henry VIII does not break away from the Catholic Church or reconciles during his lifetime. What would be the effect on English naval strategy and alliances during, I guess you meant the Tudor period before the line got cut off? I mean, he's still going to be at war with France. He was at war with France when both countries were still Catholic. He was at war with France afterwards. It might lead to slightly less tension with Spain in the Elizabethan period, but naval strategy and alliances in Henry VIII's time pretty much aren't going to change that much. Henry VIII was just happy to fight the French and whoever the French happened to bring along, regardless of what particular religious affiliation either side had. And to be perfectly fair, as kind of is exemplified there, the Catholic countries were perfectly happy to fight each other, even if they weren't accusing each other of heresy. So, given the economic circumstances that drove the conflict between between England and Spain, you probably still end up with the Spanish and English at each other's throats in the Elizabethan period anyway, just with slightly less papal blessing on one side. Grey Ghost asks, what are the newest or most recent refitted battleships or battlecruisers that a refit Conte de Cavour could win a fight with 1v1, excluding badly made shells? I'd guess maybe a Congo. The problem you have with the Cavours is that even with their refits, yes, they have speed, they're still not particularly well protected, and they only have 12.6-inch guns. So even against something like a Congo, Congo's not exactly the world's best armoured ship, but the Congo's 14-inch guns can basically go through the armour of a Conte de Cavour at any practical range where the Conte de Cavour is going to be able to hurt the Congo. So at that point, it's kind of a luck of the draw, except that Congo shells might go a little bit deeper and do a little bit more damage. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Conte de Cavours were massively more capable than they were before the refits, but the problem is, by World War II, anything they went up against, if they were faster than it probably had heavier guns and heavier armour. And if it was somewhere in the possibly in the ballpark of firepower, it would either have been a Gangut, which would have been a really bizarre confrontation to try and arrange, or Arkansas. So, I mean, there's a limited amount you could do with the Cavours. They could hurt things. Don't get me wrong. Giulio Cesare, obviously, as an example of an Italian refit battleship, did take the fight to Warspite, but they also very quickly realised that this was a bad idea. Nanami Kamiya says, I was also wondering whether Britain would still become an empire, assuming the active union still happens. An active union between a Catholic Britain and a Presbyterian Scotland. That would be a mess. That would be a real mess. I don't even want to think about that. I mean, we had enough trouble with Northern Ireland, let alone with it actually happening on, Northern Ireland versus Ireland, let alone having the same issues, except there's not a bunch of water between the feuding areas and central Britain. Not that it was particularly pleasant for the people in Ireland, to be fair, but yeah, that's... I mean, you'd probably have an empire purely just to ship off all the troublemakers, because I think at some point someone would just sit down and go, you know what, that lot of Scots over there and that lot of English over there are always trying to accuse each other of heresy. Let's put them into separate ships and separate units and send them to opposite ends of the planet and have them fight someone else. Kind of like the Spanish did with the conquistadors. People like Pizarro and Cortez, just like, please go away. Go either die horribly somewhere else or go conquer something, but we don't want you here anymore. A lot of them was basically the short version for a lot of the conquistadors. The man formerly known as Commenting is What I Do, which is a very bizarre little title, asks, have you ever heard of H.I. Sutton? Yes, I have. I've got a couple of his books. I don't know why I keep looking there. The shelf isn't there anymore. He's a major expert on submarines, and he said he's loved to collaborate with you. I would also love to collaborate with him. I will need to drop him a line, although I will have to check my schedule as to when I can publish a video, because I do have a number of collaborations I've already done and a schedule of publication for them. So I definitely do want to collaborate with him. It's just a matter of, I guess I'll have to ask him, if we do a collaboration sooner, are you happy with me potentially having to sit on the video for a while, or would you prefer to collaborate closer to the time when I can upload it? Because otherwise I might end up just being the Drac Talks to Other People channel for a while. Oh dear. BR Class 47 asks, for April Fools, could you do the skydiver from UFO? Probably not, because I don't have the faintest clue what that is. For the April Fools videos, even though they're April Fools videos, I would prefer to do something I have a vague idea of what I'm talking about. And he also says, how would late World War II be changed if the interned littorals were used by, say, the Royal Navy? That almost happened. They were thinking about hauling them over to the Pacific, but a variety of issues, including lack of range, stopped them. But to be perfectly honest, by late World War II, there's no capital ships left to fight in Europe, and going up against Japan is mostly a carrier war. So it's not really going to affect all that much, other than maybe there's a slightly additional interesting Royal Navy anti-aircraft screen. The guy everyone likes asks, what effects did the Washington Naval Treaty have on foreign nation shipbuilding programs? Quite dramatic, because one of the conditions of the Washington Naval Treaty was that you couldn't sell or transfer warships to other countries. In some ways that was aimed at Britain, so that they couldn't just say, yes, well, we are going to sell or give away or transfer in some way a bunch of capital ships to Australia and Canada and New Zealand, etc., and then just conveniently have them all back under the same flag later on. It didn't apply to cruisers and such, which is why the Australians had HMS Australia and Canberra and so on, but it did apply to capital ships. But what that meant was that when you have ships like, the South American Dreadnought arms race, none of those ships were built in South America. They were built by British and American yards for the South American customers, but under the treaty system they couldn't have that happen, because they basically have to build them themselves. So although it technically didn't stop their shipbuilding programs, that's because they didn't have a shipbuilding program at home. But in terms of their overall ship acquisition programs, it stopped a lot of foreign nations' attempts to acquire capital ships dead in their tracks, because by treaty the big powers, all the signatories, couldn't sell them new ships or any capital ships for that matter, which kind of put a bit of a brake on smaller nations' ideas about finding new capital ships for their navies. Which, I mean, that's one of the reasons why, for example, instead, whilst the Soviets ordered things like Tashkent from the Italians, I mean, there's also a bunch of other political reasons, but it's also a practical reason why the Soviets couldn't just turn around to the Italians and say, build us a battleship. They could get the Italians to design the battleship for them if they wanted to, but to actually build the battleship would require it to be built in Russia. Which is, I mean, Russia wasn't a signatory, but Italy obviously was, so the Italians couldn't really help the Russians out there. Captain Seafort asks, do you think the Borodino-class should be considered battleships or battlecruisers? The design had roughly the speed and armour of the Lions, but still slightly improved protection over the Gangots. I think it's a time period thing. So by the time the Borodinos are being built, they fit the battlecruiser bracket compared to the battleships that are being built, and also how are they considered by the navies that are building them. Broadly, they're still seen as battlecruisers, so I think they can be considered battlecruisers. They, unlike something like, say, Hood, they don't, when you compare them to broadly contemporary battleships as a whole, as opposed to special cases like Gangot or perhaps Dante Alighieri, I think, there's not a tremendous argument other than looking at very specific cases to say, oh yeah, the Borodinos could be battleships. So yeah, battlecruisers it is for me. Okay, it is 20 minutes to midnight here, so I'm going to probably wrap it up in the next 5 or 6 minutes, I think. Because, yeah, tomorrow I've got to decide which video I'm going to start recording and editing for Wednesday. I'd like to be awake for tomorrow. Right. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do says, yes, I know HRS Sutton has a YouTube channel. I subscribe to it. It's very informative, especially given the fact that, he, as something I can very much envy him for, he has the artistic capability of doing his own illustrations. Oh, if I had that kind of artistic skill. Yeah. And to be perfectly honest, subs aren't really usually very photogenic. They try and spend a lot of their time below the water. So, apart from anything else, I do probably need to speak to him at some point about licensing some of his artwork to illustrate some 5-minute guides on subs, because otherwise you're going to be looking at 300 by 230 pixel blurry photos of a sail wandering around the surface for some sub videos, because a lot of the time his artwork is pretty much the only thing that exists of any kind of decent quality on that sub. So yeah, I've got a fair bit to discuss with him at some point. Scipio Africanus says, what do you think of the Admiralty trilogy games? I don't know which ones you mean, but when you game a naval history question, what system do you use? So back in the pre-COVID days, when there was a large wargaming group nearby to where I live, which I could to be fair, mostly played 40k and Battlefleet Gothic with, but I could occasionally persuade to help me out in large scale physical wargaming of naval scenarios. We used the General Quarters system, so General Quarters 2, with some very heavy customizations for simulating proper fog of war and so forth. So that was kind of our go-to system, largely because it's one that we actually had copies of the rules for and was relatively easy to adapt in, and had enough of a granular level of detail that we could be relatively happy with the outcome. Basically, it's not a rule system that's too abstracted, but it's also not so detailed that you end up basically having to do what would have been historically the job of several thousand men with half a dozen. So I like it. I mean, people have recommended various other rules systems to me since, because let's face it, the General Quarters system is quite old. In fact, I think it's older than I am. But it's something that we know. Unfortunately, obviously during the pandemic, not able to meet, and post-pandemic, I haven't seen anything much publicity-wise about the group getting back together again. So I don't know what I'm going to do for large-scale wargaming nowadays, which makes me a bit sad. I know like odd people who'll play me at Battlefleet Gothic or 40k or Dystopian Wars or whatever, but that's for me personally playing games as opposed to large scale like 6-12 person wargaming exercises. 96831, if the British Empire hadn't suffered major losses early in World War II, i.e. Courageous, Glorious, Hood, Repulse and Prince of Wales, how would they be used? Courageous and Glorious, I suspect, would probably find a similar role to Furious, i.e. aircraft ferries for the Mediterranean, and then probably later on being used as sort of second line carriers going after targets in Norway, maybe acting as distant cover carriers for the Arctic convoys, that kind of thing. You might have also seen them operating to a degree in the Pacific. The one place I don't think you'd ever see them be deployed would be fully into the Mediterranean with Cunningham's forces, because I mean, you look at the battering the armoured carriers took by operating in the Mediterranean, and then obviously later on with the Eastern Fleet with the kamikazes, and yeah, Courageous and Glorious would not have survived that. Hood, if she'd not been lost, she would have had to been hauled into a relatively major refit in late 41, early 42, or she would have just broken down. How long that takes is a bit of an open question. She probably probably, unless they just do a really quick patch job and send her out again, in which case you might end up in the Mediterranean, but probably isn't going to see Mediterranean service, and most of the European stuff will be over by the time she's back out, so she'll probably be Eastern Fleet Eastern Fleet, Pacific Fleet operations. Repulse and Prince of Wales. I mean, Prince of Wales is a modern King George V class battleship. If there's not sunk during Force Z, she's probably going to stick around for a while in the Indian Ocean. If Operation Sea, which will probably be Somerville's flagship for, if Operation Sea historically goes about as well for the Japanese as it did historically, should probably actually end up, if anywhere, maybe even reinforcing Cunningham back in the Mediterranean, and same with Repulse. And then if they survive that, maybe going back out again with the Eastern Fleet. Sea Dodders, what if Graf Spee was converted into a light carrier and sent out as she was in real life? I'm not sure that would be entirely effective. Let me just double check how long the thing is, because I mean, okay, fair enough. You can make an argument that she's almost certainly going to be longer than an escort carrier, but let's have a look. Deutschland class cruiser, length 610 feet. Oh, yeah, that's not too bad. Independence class light carrier. 623 feet. Okay, so maybe a bit more practical than I thought. So maybe you could have a couple of dozen aircraft on a Deutschland class light carrier. I mean, she'd be a fairly effective merchant raider because aircraft can spread out and attack things on a much greater distance, and merchant ships aren't particularly durable. But she would have died pretty quickly, because you would have ended up in a position of, if it's a conversion, she's still not going to be faster than cruisers, and now cruisers don't have to worry about her that much, because operational breakdowns of aircraft, malfunctions, etc., by the time Force H catches up with her. Is it Force H? No, it's not. That's the Mediterranean. You can tell how tired I'm getting. I'm getting my forces mixed up. Basically, by the time Exeter, Ajax, and Achilles wind up finding her, she's going to be down a number of aircraft for various reasons. She can't outrun them, and now she doesn't outgun them either. And patchwork attacks by 16 aircraft here and there, assuming the three ships stay together and use their AA guns. Sure, they might get a lucky hit in here or there, but it's going to be kind of a one and done deal before the cruisers are all over her, and that'll be it. So probably slightly higher kill count for being the merchant raider, but easier to take out. It's one of the reasons I keep saying that Graf Spee might have done a bit, not Graf Spee, Graf Zeppelin might have done a bit better, because she actually has the speed to run away. And a bit more of a deeper air group to work on as well. Fushi Smith asks, what exactly do you do if you're at test depth in a submarine in 1943 and a depth charge has poked a basketball-sized hole in the engine room? Hope you sink below crush depth fast enough that it's quick. If you're at test depth already and you have that hole that size in your engine room, that's the best you can hope for. There is literally nothing else left to do at this point. Desert Foxo asks, the Royal Navy gets the Sea Mosquito they wanted in late 41 instead of in 45. What effect do they have? Depends which carriers they deploy them on. Thank you, Jake Miller. Force G at River Plate. Yeah, I'm obviously more tired than I thought I was. So if they've got Sea Mosquitoes, as I say, it depends which carriers they deploy them on. Obviously, it's a fairly big aircraft. You want them on the large carrier as you can, which probably means Well, actually, late 41, you're not going to get it on Ark Royal. I mean, as long-range strike aircraft, they're pretty darn effective, albeit you can't have as many of them. But then again, given that they didn't tend to launch Swordfish and Albacores and particularly large strike packages, it would certainly make the Royal Navy carriers a fair bit more effective. And of course, the Mosquito's a lot more able to defend itself than a Swordfish is, or an Albacore, or a Barracuda. Make pretty decent night fighters as well. The main thing, to be honest, whenever you say Sea Mosquito deployed early, would be whether highball bombs could have been deployed on a hypothetical Sea Mosquito sooner than they historically were, which would have been a really interesting little thing to go for. I mean, it also depends on how they use the Sea Mosquito, if they use it as a strike aircraft or as a big heavy fighter. But yeah, oh right, it's 10 to midnight. Okay, 2 more questions and then we're done. IO2 asks if Fisher somehow managed to conceal 2 incomparables as large light cruisers, but due to problems sourcing 20-inch guns, they carry 3 quad 15-inch guns, 3 quad 15-inch turrets instead. What are the butterflies? Frankly, if you're building incomparables, there's practically no way they're surviving the Washington Treaty. Yeah, they kind of grandfathered Hood in. They grandfathered Hood in, kind of. You can see the logic going on, because it's very interesting actually. You look at the US Navy reports about Hood in 1919, 1920, and they basically conclude that Hood as a fighting unit is better than anything in the US battle line, period, with the exception of the Colorados, as long as speed is not a relevant factor. So basically, if it's just guns and armour, they reckon Hood's better than everything except the Colorados, and if you include speed as a factor, they actually still think that Hood is even better than that as an overall fighting unit. So I personally think, and I think a few others do agree with me, that this is one of the reasons why the Royal Navy gets 2 Nelsons and keeps Hood, despite the fact that Hood is hilariously larger than everybody else's capital ships, because, you know, the US Navy is kind of saying around about Colorado levels, and then all of a sudden, when you look at the Japanese, right, they've got 2 Nagatos, the Americans have 3 Colorados, the British, who are supposed to be broadly equal in naval power to the Americans, have 2 Nelsons and a Hood, you know, three top-line capital ships, 3 American top-line capital ships. It makes a lot of sense. Whereas, yeah, if you've got a couple of thousand for incomparables cruising around, yeah, no one's going to let that stand. Either the Washington Treaty is going to be completely unrecognisable, or the British are going to have to turn them into aircraft carriers. And to be fair, as I've mentioned on previous Drydocks, an incomparable class aircraft carrier would be an absolutely hilarious thing. So, yeah. And the... okay. Last question, and then a quick, hilarious, amusing question from Fushi Smith. Packet of Birdseed asks, will there be a video on Fort Drum and the planned Pearl Harbor... The planned Pearl Harbor version? Planned Pearl Harbor version. Oh, the planned Pearl Harbor version of Fort Drum, you mean? Yeah, I'm sure it's some. Yeah, I'm sure. I know. I definitely will be doing a video at not at Fort Drum, but about Fort Drum at some point. Basically, if there's a battle or a famous naval installation or a ship I haven't covered yet, at some point I will do a video on it. It's just there's an awful lot of those, so it could take a while. And my slightly eccentric, random, well, not so random way of doing things means that hopefully everything stays interesting, because as you hopefully know, the 5-minute guides, apart from the Patreon selected one at the beginning of each month, are normally what's the chronological order of ships' requests. So it can be completely all over the place rather than trying to follow particular themes. Because then it'd be all too easy to go, oh yes, well, let's do all of these ships, and then all the people who want to know about those ships watch just that, and then they're never going to watch another 5-minute guide. So USS Grey Coast, even after you're dead, and it goes, I don't plan on dying anytime soon. Granted, my previous life history and the various accidents I've got myself into might suggest otherwise, but I wasn't deliberately trying to kill myself. I may have accidentally been hit by several vehicles, fallen down an ancient Inca pyramid, and various other things, but it wasn't deliberate. It was just slight miscalculations. Anyway. Fushi Smith's funny last super chat question says, let's say every subscriber gives $10. Okay. Would you build a functioning replica of a ship of the line with cannons and a crew? And a crew which would be us, so that we control merchant shipping? Give it a shot. I don't know how much it... I mean, I could ask the Golden Hind, the replica of the Golden Hind, like how much it costs to build that ship. But I'm sure with that kind of level of funding, we'll probably build something. Dear. Sea and Arsenal. Hello. Yeah, it's a shame. It's a shame YouTube doesn't like live streaming with firearms. Otherwise, at some point, I'd be able to show off my airsoft collection. But I have a distinct feeling that YouTube doesn't make the distinction, especially considering that, you know, a lot of airsoft firearms, especially in the UK where we don't have to have orange tips, are probably indistinguishable on a live stream from the actual ones. But there you go. Yes, so I think it's time to wrap up. It's now 3 minutes to midnight. We're almost at 4 hours. And thank you very much, everybody, for sticking with it. Hope to see some of you in April, when we're in the States. And I guess that'll be that. Sorry, I feel a little bit sorry for poor Sea and Arsenal popping in right at the very end. Yeah. Yes, so I have seen your email. Very sorry I haven't replied. It basically came in just as I was heading off to Portsmouth to film for over the Friday, Saturday, and obviously prep before. So yes, I will be responding hopefully tomorrow, maybe Tuesday. So yes, I'll be responding ASAP. But thank you very much. I did I did get to give it a quick read. And with that, before I lose complete functionality of the English language, it's time for me to go. Thank you very much, everyone, and bye-bye.